In a world where appearances dictate worth, one man's act of kindness will change everything. Marcus Johnson was once a respected engineer. Now he's just another homeless man in Boston Common, invisible to those who pass by. When he steps in to protect a young boy from bullies, he has no idea that this simple act will transform his entire life. The boy is Elijah Taylor, son of one of Boston's most prominent neurosurgeons. As their paths cross, Dr. Richard Taylor sees beyond Marcus's circumstances to the brilliant engineer who still exists beneath. From the bench of a public park to the boardroom of a prestigious hospital, Marcus rebuilds his life piece by piece, proving that true value isn't determined by circumstances, but by character and capability. Experience this emotional journey of redemption, second chances, and unexpected connections that will remind you how a single moment of courage can change multiple lives forever. Sometimes, saving someone else is the first step to saving yourself. Has someone ever seen your true value when others couldn't? Share your story of unexpected recognition in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of our shared humanity. The morning sun cast long shadows across Boston Common as Marcus Johnson carefully folded his weathered wool blanket and tucked it into his military-grade backpack, one of the few possessions remaining from his former life. At 52, the lines etched into his dark face told stories of both joy and hardship, while his still muscular frame spoke of discipline maintained even in the worst circumstances. Another day, he murmured to himself, a ritual that had begun during his Marine Corps days and continued through 20 years as a structural engineer. Now, 5 years into homelessness, the phrase served as both prayer and promise. Marcus ran a hand over his salt and pepper beard, meticulously trimmed the previous evening at the Second Chance shelter where he spent 3 nights each week. The shelter's strict 3-night policy meant he alternated between there and a hidden spot near the Charles River, where a small community of veterans had established an unspoken agreement with sympathetic park rangers. As he gathered his belongings, Marcus's gaze fell on the small framed photograph wrapped carefully in plastic. His wife Diane and daughter Aisha, both smiling on a beach in Cape Cod, taken just weeks before the drunk driver changed everything. The pain had dulled over the 5 years since the accident, but it never truly disappeared. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," called Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who power-walked through the park each morning. Unlike most who averted their eyes from the homeless, she had taken the time to learn his name. "Beautiful day ahead." "Indeed it is, Mrs. Patterson. Watch out for the uneven pavement near the fountain, they still haven't fixed it." His deep voice carried the authoritative tone developed during bridge inspections and construction site management. She waved in acknowledgement, and Marcus shouldered his pack, beginning his daily routine. First stop, the public restrooms near the visitor center, where he would brush his teeth and wash his face. The attendant, Miguel, had come to respect Marcus after an incident last winter when Marcus had de-escalated a situation with an aggressive, intoxicated man threatening the staff. "Morning, Marcus," Miguel greeted, unlocking the facilities 5 minutes early as he often did. "Coffee's fresh in the break room if you want a cup." "Much appreciated," Marcus replied with a nod. These small kindnesses, the acknowledgement of his humanity, meant everything. 20 minutes later, freshened up and with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Marcus made his way to the Boston Public Library as it opened. The security guard, a former Army man named Derek, gave him a subtle nod as he entered. Their unspoken agreement: Marcus could use the library resources as long as he remained presentable and respectful, which he always was. Inside, he claimed his usual spot in the engineering section, where he spent hours keeping his knowledge current. Today, he pulled a volume on sustainable urban infrastructure, a field that had barely existed when he'd earned his degree from Howard University decades earlier. Permeable concrete solutions for flood mitigation. He read, immediately spotting applications that would have improved a project he'd led in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. His mind still worked like the precision instrument it had always been, cataloging information, identifying structural weaknesses, solving problems. As he read, his thoughts drifted to his former life. Marcus had been one of the few black structural engineers at Wallace and Associates, where he'd specialized in disaster-resistant design. His innovations had saved countless lives when an earthquake struck San Francisco in 2011, his reinforcement techniques allowing a hospital to remain operational while buildings around it suffered catastrophic damage. "I should have applied that same cross-bracing to my own life," he thought bitterly. The chain of events that led to his current situation replayed in his mind, a familiar, painful loop. The drunk driver killing Diane and Aisha instantly. The months in a grief fog. The medical bills from his own injuries in the crash. The mistakes at work as he struggled with concentration. The drinking that began as self-medication, the termination for showing up intoxicated at a critical client meeting, the foreclosure, the depleted savings, the friends whose couches he'd occupied until their patience wore thin, and finally the streets. Mr. Johnson, the librarian's voice pulled him from his reverie. I set aside this journal article on urban infrastructure resilience, thought it might interest you. Ms. Winters, the engineering section librarian, had been quietly supportive since discovering his background. Sometimes she even solicited his opinion on the library's own structural issues, respecting his expertise despite his circumstances. Thank you, he said, accepting the publication. I appreciate you thinking of me. We received a donation of professional clothes yesterday, she added in a lower voice. Some men's suits in what looks like your size. I set them aside at the community resource desk. Marcus's pride warred briefly with practicality. I'll check on that, thank you again. Around noon, Marcus packed his notes, carefully written on paper provided by the library's Job Resource Center, and headed to his next destination. He walked with military precision through the financial district, where men and women in suits similar to those he once wore hurried past without seeing him. Occasionally, he recognized former colleagues or clients, but he'd become skilled at becoming invisible when necessary. At Sullivan Square, he stopped at a small soup kitchen run by a community center. Unlike some facilities that treated the homeless with barely concealed contempt, the volunteers here maintained an atmosphere of dignity. Marcus, called Sister Bernadette, a no-nonsense nun in her 70s who ran the kitchen with military efficiency. We're short a pair of hands today. Any chance you could help serve after you've eaten? Happy to, he replied, knowing the request wasn't charity but genuine need. The sister had discovered his organizational skills months ago and often enlisted his help with inventory and meal planning. As he ate his simple meal of vegetable soup and bread, Marcus listened to the conversations around him. A young woman newly on the streets, still shell-shocked. An older man discussing a promising lead on affordable housing. A veteran with PTSD sharing resources for dental care. The invisible community, supporting each other even as the wider world looked away. After helping serve for 2 hours and assisting with cleanup, Marcus received a bag with extra sandwiches, payment for his work, offered in a way that preserved his dignity. The forecast says rain tonight, Sister Bernadette mentioned. We've opened the community center basement for emergency shelter, Marcus nodded. I'll spread the word to those near the river. By late afternoon, Marcus had returned to Boston Common, making his way to his favorite bench near the playground. It was positioned perfectly, shade in summer, sun in winter, and a clear view of both the park entrance and the playground without appearing to watch the children, which could raise suspicions. He settled on the bench, removed his well-worn copy of Advanced Structural Analysis from his backpack, and began reviewing concepts that had once been second nature. Despite everything, he maintained his professional knowledge, clinging to the identity of engineer even as the world now saw only homeless man. As the afternoon light softened, Marcus observed the ebb and flow of park visitors, nannies with strollers, tourists consulting maps, office workers seeking fresh air during breaks. 5 years ago, he'd been one of those office workers, stopping at this very park between client meetings, his wedding ring catching the light as he checked his watch, never imagining how quickly it could all disappear. A young couple walked past, the woman pregnant, the man protectively guiding her along the path. They reminded him of himself and Diane when they were expecting Aisha. He closed his book, allowing himself a rare moment to remember Diane's laugh as they debated baby names, the wonder of feeling his daughter kick, the plans they'd made for a future that would never come. They're still with you, he reminded himself, a hand unconsciously touching the photograph in his breast pocket. Everything you do honors them. As the sun began to set, Marcus gathered his belongings, mentally reviewing his evening plans. He would visit the library again until closing, then, because of the rain forecast, make his way to the community center rather than his riverside spot. Tomorrow, he would check on the donated suits at the resource center, continue his job search, and perhaps speak with the career counselor about updating his resume. Again, each day followed this pattern, a life of routine and purpose despite his circumstances. Marcus Johnson, once a hero in combat zones and a respected professional whose designs had saved lives, now fought a different kind of battle. One against invisibility, against the erosion of dignity, against surrendering to circumstances that had ambushed him as surely as any enemy combatant ever had. He straightened his posture as he walked, embodying the Marine Corps bearing that had become second nature. Homeless, yes, but defeated, never. As Marcus made his way across the common, he had no way of knowing that tomorrow his carefully constructed routine would be interrupted by a confrontation at this very playground, one that would set in motion events that would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. The following afternoon, clouds gathered over Boston Common, promising the rain forecasted for later. Marcus had spent his morning at a workforce development center, updating his resume and applying for an entry-level drafting position at a small engineering firm. The salary would be a fraction of what he once earned, but it would be a start, a foundation to rebuild upon. Now, settled on his usual bench, Marcus alternated between reading a structural engineering journal and observing the park around him. The playground 20 yards away bustled with activity as children squealed and chased each other across the equipment. Parents clustered on benches, some attentive, others absorbed in their phones. Marcus kept his distance. A middle-aged, homeless black man had to be careful near playgrounds. He'd positioned himself precisely, visible enough to appear non-threatening, far enough to cause no concern, yet close enough to enjoy the simple sounds of childhood joy that both pained and comforted him. As the afternoon wore on, the playground gradually emptied as families headed home for dinner. Soon only a handful of children remained, mostly older ones with the independence to play while parents watched from afar. Marcus was about to return to his reading when raised voices caught his attention. Near the far end of the playground, 4 boys, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, had formed a semicircle around a smaller child. "Hey, Professor Weirdo, what's in the backpack?" The tallest boy, wearing an expensive-looking jacket, reached for the smaller child's bag. "Please leave me alone." The smaller boy's voice wavered but held determination. He was perhaps 10 years old, with warm brown skin, glasses, and a neat school uniform. His mixed-race features suggested one black parent and one white or Asian parent. "Maybe he's got his little science experiments in there," jeered another boy. "Bet he thinks he's smarter than everyone." Marcus observed carefully, recognizing the familiar dynamics of bullying. He'd seen it in the Marines, in corporate offices, and now on the playground. The boy was clearly outnumbered, and the situation was escalating. "I just want to go home," the smaller boy said, clutching a science textbook to his chest. "But we're not done talking to you, Einstein," said the tall boy, shoving the child lightly. When the smaller boy tried to step back, another boy blocked his path. Marcus closed his journal and set it aside, watching intently. He had learned over decades when to intervene and when to let situations resolve themselves. This one sat squarely in the former category. The tallest boy grabbed for the textbook. "Let's see what you're reading that makes you think you're so smart." "No," the smaller boy held tight to his book. "My dad gave me this, let go." In the ensuing tug-of-war, the smaller boy was pushed backward, losing his balance. He fell hard onto the gravel, his glasses askew on his face. The textbook went flying, landing near a puddle from earlier rain. The fall could have ended the confrontation, but instead it escalated it. One of the boys kicked the fallen child's backpack, sending school supplies scattering across the wet ground. That was enough. Marcus stood, his movement deliberate rather than rushed. He tucked his own book into his backpack and slung it over one shoulder, then walked with measured steps toward the group. "Gentlemen," he called, his voice carrying the authority developed during 20 years giving directions on construction sites. "That's quite enough." The boys turned, momentarily startled by the intrusion. Marcus saw the flicker of assessment in their eyes, taking in his worn clothes, his race, his homelessness, followed by the dismissal he'd grown accustomed to. "Mind your own business, old man," the tallest boy said, his privilege evident in both tone and stance. Marcus continued his approach, maintaining a non-threatening demeanor while projecting absolute conviction. "I am minding my business. Community safety is everyone's business." He stopped at a respectful distance, positioning himself between the fallen child and the group of bullies. "Young man," he addressed the smaller boy without looking away from the group, "are you hurt?" "No, sir," came the quiet reply as the child scrambled to collect his scattered belongings. The dynamic shifted as Marcus's presence created a new focal point. He stood straight-backed, hands visible at his sides, techniques he'd learned for de-escalation in potentially hostile environments. "4 against 1 isn't what I'd call a fair matchup," Marcus observed, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable disapproval, "especially when that one is younger and smaller." "We were just talking," protested one of the boys, suddenly less confident. "Is that right?" Marcus reached down and picked up a pencil case that had landed near his feet. He handed it to the smaller boy, who had managed to stand up. "Talking usually doesn't involve pushing someone to the ground." The tallest boy, clearly the leader, attempted to reassert control. "You can't tell us what to do, you don't even belong here." He gestured vaguely at Marcus's appearance, the implication clear. Marcus had faced far more intimidating opponents than a privileged teenager. He smiled slightly, unruffled. "Actually, this is a public park, which means it belongs to all of us, and in shared spaces we look out for each other." He turned to the smaller boy. "Your textbook." He pointed to where it had landed. The child darted over to retrieve it, wiping moisture from its cover with his sleeve. "Look, if Einstein can't take a joke, that's his problem," the leader said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Jokes are when everyone's laughing," Marcus replied evenly. "From what I observed, only your group found this situation amusing." One of the other boys tugged at the leader's sleeve. Come on, let's just go, my mom's waiting. Marcus recognized the shift, the bullies seeking a face-saving exit. He provided one. Seems like a good idea, I'm sure you all have homework waiting. The tension held for another moment before breaking. With a few muttered comments and defiant glances, the group began to move away. This isn't over, weirdo, the leader called to the smaller boy, unwilling to completely surrender his perceived dominance. Actually, it is, Marcus stated firmly. And if I see a repeat performance tomorrow, I'll be having a conversation with the park rangers who know me quite well. It was a calculated bluff. The Rangers tolerated Marcus but were unlikely to intervene in adolescent disputes, but it worked. The boys retreated, their body language conveying defeat disguised as disinterest. As the group disappeared down the path, Marcus turned his attention to the smaller boy, who was frantically checking his textbook for damage. Thank you, sir, the boy said, looking up at Marcus with genuine gratitude. His glasses had a small crack in one lens. You're welcome, young man, are you sure you're not hurt? Just my pride, the boy said with a maturity that surprised Marcus. Then he frowned, examining his textbook. And my book got wet. Let me see, Marcus said, keeping a respectful distance. When the boy held it out, Marcus examined the dampened cover. Advanced Principles of Physics. That's significant reading for someone your age. The boy's face brightened slightly. My dad says I'm advanced for my grade. He got me this book because the ones at school are too basic. Marcus nodded appreciatively. Always good to challenge yourself. He gestured to a nearby bench. Mind if we sit for a moment? Those pages will dry better if you keep the book open. The boy hesitated, the wariness familiar to Marcus. A lifetime of watching his parents caution around strangers had taught him the calculation happening in the child's mind, weighing gratitude against potential risk. I understand if you'd prefer not to, Marcus added. Safety first. No, it's okay, the boy decided, seemingly reassured by Marcus's respectful approach. My dad always says I should thank people properly when they help me. They moved to the bench, and the boy carefully laid his textbook open, placing small rocks on the corners to keep the pages from blowing in the breeze. I'm Elijah, the boy offered, adjusting his cracked glasses. Marcus Johnson, Marcus replied, extending his hand for a formal handshake, which Elijah returned with surprising firmness. As they sat, a woman walking her dog passed by, her eyes narrowing as she observed them. She slowed, phone in hand, clearly concerned about the interaction between the well-dressed schoolboy and the obviously homeless man. Everything okay here? She called, her question directed at Elijah while her suspicious gaze remained fixed on Marcus. Before Marcus could speak, Elijah responded with unexpected conviction. Yes, ma'am, this gentleman helped me when some bigger kids were bullying me. The woman looked unconvinced. Are you sure? I saw him talking to you and I thought. She let the implication hang in the air. Marcus remained calm, accustomed to such assumptions, but Elijah surprised him again. He rescued my physics book, the boy said, pointing to the drying textbook. Those boys pushed me down and were going to throw it in a puddle. Mr. Johnson stopped them. The woman glanced at the advanced textbook, then at Elijah's private school uniform, visibly recalculating her assumptions. Well, that was kind of him, she hesitated. Do you need me to call someone for you, your parents? No, thank you, Elijah said politely. My dad knows I walk home through the park. I do it every day. Still looking uncertain, the woman nodded. Well, if you're sure, she continued along the path, but Marcus noticed her stopping a short distance away, phone still in hand, watching them. Sorry about that, Elijah said with surprising awareness. Adults always think I need protecting. Marcus smiled slightly. Can't fault them for being cautious. World can be dangerous. But they make assumptions, Elijah said, his young face suddenly serious. Like those boys. They assumed because I like physics and math that I'm weird, and that lady assumed because you're, he trailed off, suddenly unsure. Because I'm homeless, Marcus finished matter-of-factly, and black, both things make some people uncomfortable. Elijah nodded slowly. That's not fair. No, it's not, Marcus agreed, but understanding why people act the way they do is the first step to changing it. He gestured to the physics book. That's what science is about, right? Observing, understanding, then improving. Elijah's eyes widened with appreciation. Exactly, that's what my dad says too. He ran his fingers carefully over the drying pages. He's a doctor. He says science makes the invisible visible. Marcus nodded. Smart man, your father. He is, Elijah said proudly. Then after a moment's hesitation, what do you do, Mr. Johnson? The question hung in the air, complex in its simplicity. Marcus considered his answer carefully. I was a structural engineer, he said finally, choosing honesty. I designed buildings to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. Was, Elijah asked, catching the past tense. Life takes unexpected turns sometimes, Marcus said, his tone gentle but final. Elijah seemed to understand the boundary. He returned to his book, checking if the pages were drying properly. This talks about structural integrity too, like how forces work on different materials. Marcus smiled genuinely now. That's a fundamental principle in engineering. Everything I designed had to account for different forces: gravity, wind, seismic activity. Like bridges? Elijah asked, his interest piqued. Bridges, hospitals, office buildings, Marcus confirmed. Each structure has its own challenges. As they spoke, the woman who had been watching them finally departed, apparently satisfied that Elijah was in no danger. The sun emerged briefly from behind the clouds, warming the bench where they sat. For 20 minutes, Marcus found himself explaining basic engineering concepts, translating the physics in Elijah's textbook into real-world applications. The boy absorbed everything with remarkable comprehension, asking questions that revealed genuine understanding. It was the most professional conversation Marcus had enjoyed in years, a reminder of who he had been, who he still was beneath the circumstances. When the textbook was sufficiently dry, Elijah carefully closed it and returned it to his backpack. "I should probably head home," he said, sounding reluctant. "My dad will be home late, but Mrs. Garcia checks on me at 6. Marcus nodded, standing up. "I'll walk with you to the park exit," he offered, "just to make sure those boys don't come back." Elijah agreed, and they set off down the path together, continuing their discussion of structural engineering principles. As they walked, Marcus maintained an appropriate distance, mindful of appearances but committed to ensuring the boys' safety. At the park's edge, where the common met the city streets, Marcus prepared to say goodbye, but Elijah hesitated. "Which way are you headed?" The boy asked. "I have some business at the library," Marcus replied, glossing over the fact that the library offered warmth and shelter from the approaching rain. "Oh," Elijah looked down the street toward what was clearly an affluent neighborhood. "I live that way, about 6 blocks. Marcus understood the unspoken request. "Would you like me to walk with you, just to be sure?" Elijah nodded, relief evident in his expression. "If it's not too much trouble, sometimes those boys wait." "No trouble at all," Marcus assured him, though he knew his presence in that neighborhood would attract attention. The safety of this thoughtful, intelligent child outweighed his own discomfort. As they walked, their conversation shifted from engineering to Elijah's life. His father was often busy with work. His mother had passed away when he was very young. He was in advanced classes but struggled to connect with classmates who didn't share his interests. "Dad says being smart is a gift," Elijah explained as they turned onto a tree-lined street of impressive brownstones. "But sometimes it feels lonely." "Intelligence sets you apart," Marcus agreed, "but it also connects you to ideas and people across time and space. Newton, Einstein, Katherine Johnson, they're your intellectual family." Elijah considered this. "I never thought about it that way." They stopped at the corner of what was clearly Elijah's street. Marcus could see security systems on every home and a car service dropping off a well-dressed woman 2 doors down. "This is close enough," Marcus said gently. "I think you'll be safe from here." Elijah nodded, understanding Marcus's unstated concern. "Thank you again, Mr. Johnson. Will you be at the park tomorrow?" The question caught Marcus off guard, the simple human connection it represented. "Most likely, same bench around the same time. Maybe I could show you my science project ideas," Elijah suggested, "if you don't mind." "I'd be honored," Marcus replied, genuinely moved. As Elijah headed toward his home, Marcus watched until the boy was safely inside a stately brownstone. Then he turned back toward the park, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. The encounter had reminded him painfully of what he had lost, not just family and career, but the simple dignity of being seen as someone who could offer protection rather than represent a threat. What Marcus didn't know, as he headed back toward the library to escape the first drops of rain, was that the interaction he'd just experienced would prove to be far more consequential than a simple act of kindness. The ripples from this afternoon would soon grow into waves that would fundamentally alter the course of his life, and the lives of those he had just encountered. The following afternoon arrived with clear skies and a brisk autumn breeze. Marcus had risen early, visited the community center to shower and change into his cleanest clothes, and spent the morning at the public library researching the engineering firm where he'd applied for work. If they called for an interview, he wanted to be prepared. By 3 o'clock, Marcus had settled on his usual bench, a notebook open beside him with carefully drawn structural diagrams. The workforce development counselor had suggested he compile a portfolio of recent work to demonstrate his continued competence despite his employment gap. Though lacking design software, Marcus's hand-drawn illustrations showcased both his technical knowledge and precision. The playground was busy with afternoon activity, but Marcus focused on his work, aware that yesterday's incident might have drawn unwanted attention. He'd noticed a park maintenance worker watching him more closely than usual, and he maintained a deliberately non-threatening posture, his actions transparent. "Mr. Johnson?" Marcus looked up to see Elijah approaching, backpack bouncing against his small frame as he hurried along the path. The boy wore the same school uniform as yesterday, but his cracked glasses had been replaced with an identical pair in perfect condition. "Elijah," Marcus greeted him with a small smile, "I see you got your glasses fixed." Dad always keeps a spare pair, Elijah explained, slightly out of breath. He says it's important to be prepared for contingencies. The boy pronounced the word carefully, clearly proud of his vocabulary. Marcus nodded approvingly. Your father sounds like a practical man. He is, Elijah agreed, then hesitated, glancing at the bench. May I sit with you? I brought my science project notes like I mentioned. Of course, Marcus replied, shifting slightly to make room while maintaining appropriate distance. He closed his own notebook. How was school today? Boring, Elijah admitted, sitting down and carefully removing a folder from his backpack. We're studying simple machines in science class, but I already understand the principles. Sometimes the fundamentals seem tedious when you're ready for more advanced concepts, Marcus observed. But every complex system relies on those basic principles. The most impressive structures I ever designed still depended on simple physics. Elijah considered this, then nodded. I guess that makes sense, like how quantum physics still has to account for gravity. Marcus raised an eyebrow, impressed. Exactly, your understanding is quite advanced for your age. The boy beamed at the recognition. Dad says I get it from my mom. She was a chemical engineer before. He trailed off, his expression momentarily clouding. Marcus recognized the unspoken loss, so similar to his own. It's a fine legacy, he said gently. Carrying forward someone's passion is a way of honoring them. Elijah looked up, surprised by the perception. That's what Dad says too. A moment of understanding passed between them, the recognition of shared experience despite their vastly different circumstances. Elijah broke the silence by opening his folder. I'm trying to design a scale model for the science fair. It's about earthquake-resistant buildings. He hesitated. Since you said that was your specialty, I thought maybe. I'd be happy to look at your ideas, Marcus said, feeling a spark of professional purpose he hadn't experienced in years. For the next 45 minutes, they discussed Elijah's project. The boy had impressive initial concepts but lacked practical understanding of how to translate them into a working model. Marcus explained the principles of base isolation and tuned mass dampers in terms the child could understand, sketching simple diagrams on a blank page of Elijah's notebook. So the building doesn't try to resist the movement, it works with it, Elijah summarized, his eyes bright with comprehension. Precisely, Marcus confirmed. It's like being in a boat on rough water. You don't fight the waves, you design the boat to ride them. As they talked, Marcus noticed Elijah periodically checking his watch. Are you expected somewhere? He asked during a pause in their discussion. Elijah nodded. Mrs. Garcia checks on me at home by 6. Dad works late most days. At the hospital. Marcus guessed, remembering the boy had mentioned his father was a doctor. Yes, he's a neurosurgeon, Elijah said with obvious pride. He operates on people's brains and spinal cords. Marcus whistled softly. That's demanding work. He says it's worth it because he helps people, Elijah said, but it means he's not home much. The simple statement carried a weight of loneliness that Marcus recognized all too well. Does Mrs. Garcia stay with you? Marcus asked, concerned about the boy's supervision. No, she lives next door. She gives me dinner and checks homework, then Dad comes home later. Elijah adjusted his glasses. I'm very responsible. Dad says I'm mature for my age. I can see that, Marcus agreed, though he felt a twinge of concern about the child's solitary routine. Elijah gathered his notes, carefully organizing them in his folder. I should start heading home. Those boys from yesterday, they sometimes wait by the pond. Marcus glanced at his watch. He had planned to attend a job search workshop at the community center at 5, but Elijah's safety took precedence. I'll walk with you again if you'd like. The relief on the boy's face was answer enough. They packed up their respective materials and set off through the park, continuing their discussion of structural engineering principles as they walked. Near the pond, they spotted 2 of yesterday's bullies loitering by the path. Upon seeing Marcus walking alongside Elijah, the boys quickly changed direction, their body language communicating clear avoidance. They're scared of you, Elijah observed with satisfaction. Not of me specifically, Marcus corrected. They're wary of consequences. Bullies prefer situations where they perceive no risk to themselves. Like a structural weak point, Elijah suggested, connecting the concept to their earlier discussion. Marcus smiled at the apt analogy. Exactly. In engineering, we identify and reinforce weak points. In life, sometimes just making people aware that someone is watching can reinforce proper behavior. As they approached the edge of the wealthy neighborhood where Elijah lived, Marcus again prepared to say goodbye at a respectful distance from the actual residences. This is far enough, he said as they reached the same corner as yesterday. I think you'll be safe from here. Elijah nodded but hesitated. Mr. Johnson, may I ask you something? Of course. Why are you? The boy struggled with his phrasing. I mean, if you know so much about engineering, why aren't you? Why am I homeless? Marcus finished gently. Elijah looked both embarrassed and curious. You don't have to answer. Dad says personal questions can make people uncomfortable. Your father gives good advice, Marcus said, but it's a fair question. He considered how to explain his situation to a 10-year-old without burdening him with too much darkness. I had a good career and a family, then I lost my wife and daughter in an accident. Elijah's eyes widened. I'm sorry. Thank you, Marcus acknowledged. After that, I made some poor decisions. Grief can cloud judgment. By the time I started thinking clearly again, I'd lost my job, my home, and most of my connections. Couldn't you get another engineering job? Elijah asked with the straightforward logic of childhood. It's not that simple, Marcus explained. Employers want recent experience, references, a stable address, a professional appearance. He gestured to his worn clothing. I apply for positions when I can, but the gap in my employment history raises questions I'm not always prepared to answer. Elijah processed this information with remarkable thoughtfulness for his age. That doesn't seem fair. You know how to do the job, why should other things matter? In an ideal world, they wouldn't, Marcus agreed, but we live in this one with all its flaws and biases. My dad says systems can change if enough people work to change them. Your dad sounds like a wise man, Marcus said, genuinely impressed by the father who had instilled such values in his son. And he's right, systems can change, they just change slowly, often one person at a time. Elijah nodded, then glanced at his watch again. I really should go now, but will you be at the park tomorrow? I have more questions about my project. The request touched something deep in Marcus, the human need to be useful, to share knowledge, to connect. I expect I'll be there, weather permitting. Great, Elijah's face brightened. Maybe I could bring my sketch model. Dad got me some materials, but I'm not sure how to assemble them properly. I'd be happy to help, Marcus said, realizing he was genuinely looking forward to it, the first time in years he'd anticipated something with pleasure rather than necessity. As Elijah turned to go, he paused. Mr. Johnson, thank you, not just for the bullies, but for explaining things to me. No one else takes the time. The simple gratitude hit Marcus with unexpected force. You're welcome, Elijah. Thank you for your excellent questions. A good engineer always asks why. With a final wave, Elijah hurried down the street toward his home. Marcus watched until the boy was safely inside the same brownstone as yesterday, then turned back toward the park, his mind full of their conversation. He had missed the community center workshop, but somehow it didn't matter. For the first time in years, he had used his professional knowledge for something meaningful. The sensation of purpose, of being valued for his mind rather than pitied for his circumstances, was almost overwhelming. As Marcus walked back through the park, he found himself mentally refining Elijah's project design, considering materials and methods that would be accessible to a child. The thoughts flowed naturally, his engineer's mind engaging with a real problem rather than theoretical exercises. Without realizing it, he walked with straighter posture, his military bearing returning as if awakened by the reminder of his capabilities. Near the library, Marcus encountered Miguel from the park facilities. Evening, Marcus, the man greeted him. Headed to the library before closing? That's the plan, Marcus confirmed. Miguel hesitated. Look, some woman called the park office yesterday asking questions about a homeless man talking to a child by the playground. Marcus felt his shoulders tense. I intervened when some boys were bullying a younger child. Nothing improper occurred. I figured as much, Miguel assured him. I told them you're a regular, never cause problems, just wanted to give you a heads up, people make assumptions. I appreciate that, Marcus said, the familiar weight of others' perceptions settling back on his shoulders. The boy's fine, we were discussing engineering, he has a science project. Miguel nodded. Cool, just watch yourself, you know. People see what they expect to see. After Miguel continued on his rounds, Marcus stood for a moment considering his options. Perhaps it would be better to avoid further interactions with Elijah, safer for both of them. The boy could find another mentor, someone whose circumstances wouldn't raise eyebrows or prompt calls to authorities. But as Marcus resumed walking toward the library, he remembered the light of understanding in Elijah's eyes when a complex concept finally clicked. The genuine appreciation for knowledge shared, the connection between two minds that transcended their different circumstances. No, Marcus decided aloud, his voice firm in the gathering dusk. I made a commitment to that boy, I'll keep it. He had lost too much already to surrender this small but significant opportunity to be of real value to someone. If people wanted to question his motives, let them. He knew the truth of his intentions, and increasingly so did Elijah. What Marcus didn't yet realize was how significant this decision would prove to be, not just for Elijah's science project, but for the trajectory of both their lives. The simple act of keeping his word to a 10-year-old boy would set in motion events neither of them could have anticipated, creating ripples that would grow into waves strong enough to alter the course of Marcus's seemingly immovable circumstances. 2 days had passed since Marcus's last meeting with Elijah. After their conversation, Marcus had spent much of his time at the library researching materials and methods for earthquake-resistant model buildings appropriate for a science fair project. He had carefully written down his recommendations, including sketches and a list of household items that could serve as affordable substitutes for specialized materials. The weather had turned cold overnight, an early frost coating the grass of Boston Common with a silvery shimmer. Marcus had spent an uncomfortable night at his riverside spot, the community center being full due to the sudden temperature drop. His military training had prepared him for physical discomfort, but at 52, his body didn't recover as quickly as it once had. Now, as afternoon settled over the park, Marcus sat on his usual bench, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee provided by Sister Bernadette after he'd helped organize the soup kitchen's storage room that morning. The warm beverage was a small luxury, one he savored as he watched for Elijah's familiar figure. The boy hadn't specified which day he would return with his project materials, but Marcus had made a point to be available. Instead of reading or sketching, Marcus simply observed the park today, conserving energy after the cold night. His attention was drawn to a new security guard patrolling near the playground, a young man with an overzealous demeanor and a freshly pressed uniform. Marcus had learned to identify potentially problematic authority figures through subtle indicators: the slightly widened stance, the hand that rested too readily near equipment, the scanning gaze that lingered with suspicion rather than routine observation. This guard was displaying all those warning signs. Marcus had witnessed similar behavior countless times, from military police to corporate security to park rangers. Some people sought authority positions for the wrong reasons, and their bias often revealed itself in their body language long before it manifested in their actions. As predicted, it took less than 20 minutes for the guard to approach. "Afternoon," the man said, his tone falsely casual, his name badge read Reynolds. "You've been sitting here a while," Marcus nodded politely. "Just enjoying the park." He kept his voice measured and respectful, his posture non-threatening. "We've had some complaints about loitering," Reynolds said, making a show of scanning the area. "Parks for recreation, not camping out." "I'm well aware of the regulations," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm not camping, just sitting, same as anyone else." He gestured towards several other individuals on benches throughout the visible area. Reynolds's expression hardened slightly. "Thing is, these other folks don't seem to be here day after day. They've got jobs, homes to go to." The implication hung in the air between them. Marcus had encountered this treatment too many times to be surprised by it, but the familiar sting of dehumanization never fully dulled. "I'm not violating any park rules," Marcus stated calmly, maintaining eye contact. "I have the same right to public spaces as any citizen." "Look," Reynolds said, lowering his voice, "I'm just trying to keep the park family-friendly, understand? Parents get nervous seeing certain individuals hanging around the playground." Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. "I'm sitting on a public bench well away from the playground, bothering no one. There have been reports," Reynolds continued, "of you interacting with a child multiple days now." Now the true motivation became clear. The woman who had observed him with Elijah had indeed made a formal complaint. "A young boy was being bullied," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the anger building beneath his calm exterior. "I intervened to ensure his safety. We then had a conversation about his school project. Nothing improper occurred." Reynolds looked skeptical. "Still, it's concerning to parents when someone in your situation spends time with children." "My situation," Marcus echoed, allowing just enough edge into his voice to establish he wouldn't be easily intimidated. "You know what I mean," Reynolds replied, gesturing vaguely at Marcus's worn clothing and backpack. "Look, I'm not trying to be the bad guy here, but maybe find another spot away from where the kids play." "And if I don't," Marcus asked quietly, "will you arrest me for sitting legally in a public park? On what charge exactly?" The confrontation hung in tense silence. Reynolds clearly hadn't expected such composed resistance. Before he could respond, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade pulled up at the curb alongside the park, drawing both men's attention. The vehicle stood out. Government officials and corporate executives typically use the park's main entrance with its dedicated parking area. This driver had stopped at a service access point, technically a no-parking zone. A man emerged from the back seat tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with a burgundy tie. He was black, perhaps in his mid-40s, with closely cropped hair graying at the temples and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance despite his athletic build. He carried himself with the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to authority. As the man approached the park entrance, a smaller figure bounded from the SUV's other side, Elijah, carrying a shoebox-sized container and wearing an excited expression. "Dad, he usually sits over here," the boy was saying, tugging his father toward the path that led to Marcus's bench. Marcus stood instinctively, military habit resurfacing in the presence of what his instincts registered as a commanding officer, though the man was clearly a civilian. The timing could not have been more problematic, with Reynolds still standing confrontationally nearby. Elijah spotted Marcus and waved enthusiastically. "Mr. Johnson, I brought my project materials, and my dad wanted to meet you." Reynolds's posture changed immediately upon seeing the well-dressed man accompanying the child. He straightened, adopting a more professional demeanor as Elijah led his father directly to Marcus's bench. "Dad, this is Mr. Johnson, the engineer I told you about," Elijah said proudly. "Mr. Johnson, this is my dad, Dr. Taylor." "Dr. Richard Taylor," the man said, extending his hand with a warm smile that reached his eyes. Elijah has talked about nothing else for 2 days but the engineer who rescued him from bullies and is helping with his science project. Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Marcus Johnson, sir, your son is remarkably bright. It's been a pleasure discussing engineering principles with him." Dr. Taylor nodded, a mixture of pride and gratitude in his expression. "He said you have a background in structural engineering with a focus on disaster-resistant design. That's impressive." Before Marcus could respond, Reynolds cleared his throat pointedly. "Excuse me, Dr. Taylor. I'm Officer Reynolds, Park Security. I should inform you that we've had some concerns about this individual spending time with children in the park." Dr. Taylor turned to the security guard, his expression cooling several degrees. "Is that so? What specific concerns, Officer Reynolds?" Reynolds faltered slightly under the doctor's direct gaze. "Well, sir, it's just that, given his current situation, we want to ensure the safety of all park visitors, especially children." "His situation?" Dr. Taylor echoed, using the same technique Marcus had employed moments earlier. "Dad," Elijah interjected, his young voice surprisingly authoritative, "Mr. Johnson helped me when those boys were pushing me around. The security guards weren't anywhere around then. He's been teaching me about earthquake-resistant structures for my science project." Dr. Taylor placed a hand on his son's shoulder, then returned his attention to the security guard. "So let me understand this correctly. You're concerned about a man who protected my son from bullies and has been voluntarily sharing his professional knowledge to further my son's education." "Sir, I was simply responding to concerns raised by other park visitors," Reynolds said defensively. "I see," Dr. Taylor replied. "And would these concerns have been raised if Mr. Johnson were wearing a business suit rather than casual attire, or if his skin tone were different? I'm curious about the criteria for determining who represents a threat in this park." Reynolds's face flushed. "Sir, that's not what you meant," Dr. Taylor finished. "Perhaps not consciously, but I suggest you examine the assumptions underlying your approach." He reached into his suit jacket and produced a business card, which he handed to the stunned security guard. "I'm the chief of neurosurgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. If there are further concerns about Mr. Johnson's presence in this public park, I'd appreciate hearing about them directly." Reynolds stared at the card, visibly processing the implications of having confronted someone under the protection of a prominent physician. "Of course, doctor, I apologize for any misunderstanding." "I believe your apology should be directed to Mr. Johnson," Dr. Taylor suggested firmly. After a moment of obvious internal struggle, Reynolds turned to Marcus. "Sorry for the confusion, sir. Enjoy your afternoon." Without waiting for a response, he retreated down the path, radio in hand. Once the guard was out of earshot, Dr. Taylor turned back to Marcus with a genuine smile. "Please, don't let me interrupt your conversation with my son. Elijah has been extremely excited to show you his project materials. Dad bought everything on the list I made from our talk." Elijah exclaimed, setting his container on the bench and opening it to reveal various building materials: craft sticks, rubber bands, clay, small weights, and other items perfect for constructing a model building. "You have excellent taste in construction supplies, Dr. Taylor," Marcus commented, examining the materials with professional interest. "I merely followed the expert recommendations my son conveyed," Dr. Taylor replied with a warm chuckle. "Though I admit I was intrigued by the engineering principles Elijah described, I'm familiar with medical construction standards, but earthquake resistance is outside my field." "Dad's hospital is getting a new wing," Elijah explained importantly. "He has to approve all the plans." "Is that so?" Marcus said, his interest genuinely piqued. "New medical construction presents unique structural challenges." "Indeed it does," Dr. Taylor agreed. "Perhaps." He hesitated, then continued with careful consideration. "Mr. Johnson, I don't want to impose, but would you be willing to join us for dinner this evening? Elijah clearly benefits from your expertise, and I'd value the opportunity to thank you properly for helping him." The invitation caught Marcus completely off guard. He had gone from being accosted by security to being invited to dinner by a prominent physician within the span of 10 minutes. The rapid shift left him momentarily speechless. "Please say yes, Mr. Johnson," Elijah urged. "I can show you my whole project setup at home." Marcus looked from the eager boy to his father's genuine expression. He was acutely aware of his appearance. While he'd maintained cleanliness at the shelter facilities, his clothes were visibly worn and he hadn't had a proper haircut in months. The prospect of entering the Taylor home in his current state was daunting. Dr. Taylor seemed to read his hesitation accurately. We're having a simple meal at home, nothing formal. If you have other commitments, we understand, but the invitation is sincere. Marcus thought of his other commitments, finding a warm place to sleep, perhaps attending a job search workshop at the community center, checking the library's job board one more time. None of these compared to the opportunity before him, a proper meal, professional conversation, and most importantly, continuing to help Elijah with his project. I would be honored, Dr. Taylor, Marcus finally replied. Thank you for the invitation. Excellent, Dr. Taylor said, checking his watch. I need to make a quick stop at the hospital to check on a patient, then we can head home. Would you prefer to meet us there in about an hour, or would you like to ride with us now? The patient visit won't take long. Again, Marcus was struck by the consideration being shown. Dr. Taylor was giving him the option of maintaining independence rather than assuming he had no transportation of his own. The small gesture of respect meant more than the doctor could possibly know. I'm happy to accompany you now if that's convenient, Marcus decided. I've always been interested in hospital architecture. Perfect, Dr. Taylor said. Elijah, help Mr. Johnson with his things. As they walked toward the waiting SUV, Marcus was keenly aware of the stares from other park visitors. The sight of a homeless black man walking alongside one of Boston's prominent physicians and his son created a visual dissonance that drew attention. Marcus noticed Reynolds watching from a distance, confusion evident in his expression. Dr. Taylor opened the passenger door for Marcus with the same respect he would show any colleague. Please make yourself comfortable. Elijah, you can show Mr. Johnson your project notebook on the way. As the luxury vehicle pulled away from the curb, Marcus caught a final glimpse of the park bench where he had spent countless hours over the past years. The simple wooden seat had been his office, his dining room, his place of both refuge and exposure. Now he was leaving it behind, temporarily at least, for an experience so normal to most people but extraordinary in his current circumstances: dinner with a family in a home. What Marcus couldn't know, as the Escalade merged smoothly into Boston traffic, was that this unexpected encounter would prove to be the pivotal moment he had neither sought nor anticipated, the intersection of past and future, of professional knowledge and personal redemption. The man sitting beside him, navigating through traffic with easy confidence, would become far more than a grateful parent or casual acquaintance. But such revelations lay ahead. For now, as Elijah eagerly showed him detailed project notes from the back seat, Marcus allowed himself something he had carefully rationed for 5 long years: hope. The Escalade glided to a stop in the circular driveway of Massachusetts General Hospital's administrative entrance. Dr. Taylor turned to Marcus with a courteous nod. This should only take about 15 minutes, he explained. I need to check on a post-operative patient. Feel free to wait here with Elijah or come inside if you'd prefer. Dad, can we show Mr. Johnson the new wing plans? Elijah asked excitedly. They're in your office, right? Dr. Taylor considered the request for a moment. That's an excellent idea. Mr. Johnson might have some valuable insights. He turned to Marcus. Would you mind accompanying us? My office has the preliminary designs for the hospital expansion. I'd be interested to see them, Marcus replied honestly. The opportunity to view current architectural plans appealed to his professional instincts. The 3 of them entered the hospital through a private entrance reserved for senior staff. Marcus was immediately conscious of the stark contrast between his worn appearance and the polished environment. Despite Dr. Taylor's respectful treatment, the security guard at the desk gave Marcus a questioning look. Evening, Dr. Taylor, the guard greeted, his eyes lingering on Marcus. Good evening, Robert, Dr. Taylor responded, his tone pleasantly authoritative. This is Mr. Johnson, a structural engineering consultant who's providing input on the West Wing expansion. He'll be accompanying me to my office. The simple lie, or perhaps reframing of the truth, was delivered with such natural confidence that the guard merely nodded and issued Marcus a visitor badge without further question. As they entered the elevator, Marcus felt a mixture of gratitude and discomfort at Dr. Taylor's intervention. The doctor had spared him the indignity of scrutiny, but the ease with which he'd done so highlighted the vast difference in their current stations in life. The new wing has some interesting design challenges, Dr. Taylor commented as the elevator ascended. Specialized surgery suites require unique considerations for vibration damping and emergency power systems. The mechanical isolation systems have evolved significantly in recent years, Marcus responded, falling naturally into professional discourse. When I worked on the San Francisco General Hospital retrofit, we implemented a multi-layer approach to mitigate both seismic events and equipment vibration. Dr. Taylor's eyebrows raised slightly. You were involved in the SFGH project. That's considered a benchmark in hospital seismic design. Before Marcus could respond, the elevator arrived at the executive floor. The doors opened to reveal an elegantly appointed hallway with wood paneling and subtle lighting. Names and titles were displayed on each door they passed: department heads, administrative directors, and chief physicians. Dr. Taylor's office was at the end of the hall, a corner suite with his name and chief of neurosurgery etched on a brass plate. He unlocked the door and gestured for Marcus and Elijah to enter. The space was impressive without being ostentatious, clearly the office of someone who valued both function and aesthetics. One wall displayed Dr. Taylor's credentials: degrees from Harvard Medical School and Johns Hopkins, awards from medical associations, and photographs with notable figures in medicine and politics. Another wall was lined with medical texts and journals. His desk was large but organized, with 3 computer monitors arranged in a semicircle. "Make yourself comfortable," Dr. Taylor invited, indicating a small conference table in the corner of the office. "Let me check on my patient quickly, and I'll be right back with the expansion plans." After Dr. Taylor left, Elijah immediately began exploring the office, clearly comfortable in the environment. "Dad lets me do homework here sometimes when he has evening surgeries," he explained, settling into a chair by the conference table. Marcus remained standing, taking in the surroundings with careful observation. The office revealed much about Dr. Taylor: a methodical mind, a preference for organization, a balance of professional achievement and personal touches. Several framed photos showed Dr. Taylor with a younger Elijah, but Marcus noted the absence of a mother figure in any recent pictures. His attention was drawn to a shelf containing architectural models of hospital buildings, including one he recognized immediately. "That's the Loma Linda University Medical Center," Marcus said, moving closer to examine the detailed model. "I consulted on the base isolation system for their seismic retrofit." "You did?" Elijah asked, impressed. "Dad has models of all the hospitals with the best disaster-resistant designs. He says doctors can only help people if the hospital stays standing." Marcus nodded, studying the other models. Each represented a significant achievement in medical facility design, particularly regarding disaster resilience. The collection showed Dr. Taylor's deep interest in the subject, beyond what might be expected of even a senior physician. Before they could discuss further, Dr. Taylor returned carrying a large tube of blueprints and a tablet computer. "Patients recovering well," he announced, placing the materials on the conference table. "Now, let me show you what we're working on." He unrolled the blueprints to reveal the preliminary designs for the hospital's new West Wing, a 6-story addition dedicated to neurosurgery and advanced imaging. Marcus leaned forward, professional interest immediately engaged. "The primary challenge," Dr. Taylor explained, "is integrating advanced imaging equipment that requires perfect stability with a design that can withstand significant seismic activity." "These are preliminary structural plans?" Marcus asked, his trained eye already identifying potential issues in the design. "Yes, our engineering firm delivered these last month," Dr. Taylor confirmed. "The project is still in the planning phase." Marcus studied the drawings with growing concern. "The vibration isolation system they've proposed is inadequate for the new 7 Tesla MRI technology," he observed, pointing to a specific section. "And the emergency power routing creates a single point of failure that could compromise the entire wing during a disaster scenario." Dr. Taylor looked impressed. "That aligns with my concerns, though I couldn't articulate the technical aspects as precisely. Our board has been pushing back on my requests for design revisions." As they discussed the plans, Marcus's expertise became increasingly evident. He identified multiple structural and systems issues, explaining each in clear terms while suggesting alternative approaches. Dr. Taylor took notes on his tablet, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own sophisticated understanding of facility requirements. Elijah watched with fascination, absorbing the technical discussion and occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions for his age. After nearly 40 minutes of detailed review, Dr. Taylor sat back in his chair, studying Marcus with new appreciation. "Your analysis is more comprehensive than what we received from our contracted firm after 3 months of consultation." Marcus shrugged slightly. "I've specialized in disaster-resistant medical facilities. The principles become second nature after a while." "Johnson," Dr. Taylor said suddenly, as if making a connection. "Marcus Johnson, wait." He turned to his computer and performed a quick search. After a moment, he swiveled the monitor toward Marcus. "Is this you?" On the screen was a professional journal article titled "Innovative Base Isolation Techniques for Critical Medical Infrastructure," authored by Marcus Johnson, Ph.D., P.E., and dated 7 years earlier. Marcus nodded, a complex mixture of pride and pain washing over him at seeing evidence of his former professional standing. "Yes, that's my work." Dr. Taylor looked at him with new understanding. You're that Marcus Johnson, the lead designer for the Harbor Medical Center that remained operational after the 2019 earthquake. I was part of the design team, yes, Marcus acknowledged quietly. Dr. Taylor stared at him for a long moment, the obvious question hanging unspoken between them. How had a man of such accomplishment ended up homeless? Dad, Elijah intervened with the directness of childhood. Mr. Johnson lost his family in an accident. Then he lost his job and his home. Dr. Taylor's expression shifted to one of compassion without pity, the look of a physician who had witnessed how quickly life could change for anyone. I'm very sorry for your loss, he said simply. Thank you, Marcus replied, grateful for the straightforward acknowledgement. After a moment of respectful silence, Dr. Taylor gathered the blueprints. We should head home for dinner. Mrs. Garcia is preparing something special tonight. The drive to the Taylor residence took them through Boston's historic Beacon Hill neighborhood. The elegant brownstone where Dr. Taylor and Elijah lived was exactly as Marcus had imagined, classic architecture with tasteful modern updates visible through the windows. As they parked in a small private garage adjacent to the house, Marcus felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the anxiety of entering a world he had once belonged to but now approached as an outsider. He had dined in homes like this before, discussed professional matters with colleagues of similar standing to Dr. Taylor, moved through such spaces with the easy confidence of belonging. Mr. Johnson, are you coming? Elijah called, already halfway to the front door. Marcus shouldered his backpack, the repository of his remaining possessions, and followed. He had considered leaving it in the car but decided against it. If this evening proved uncomfortable, he wanted the option of a quick, dignified exit. The interior of the Taylor home was as impressive as its exterior: high ceilings, restored original woodwork, and a thoughtful blend of antique and contemporary furnishings. Family photographs lined the staircase, and bookshelves filled with medical texts, literary classics, and children's books suggested a household that valued knowledge and learning. Please make yourself comfortable in the living room, Dr. Taylor invited, gesturing toward a well-appointed space with comfortable seating. I'll let Mrs. Garcia know we're home. As Dr. Taylor disappeared toward what was presumably the kitchen, Elijah led Marcus to the living room, chattering excitedly about his science project. I've set everything up in the study, the boy explained. After dinner we can work on the model if that's okay. Of course, Marcus agreed, carefully taking a seat on a leather armchair that probably cost more than a year's salary in his former life. While Elijah retrieved his project notebook, Marcus observed the living room's details. A grand piano stood in one corner, sheet music open on its stand. Nearby, a chess set displayed a game in progress. Medical journals were stacked neatly on a side table alongside what appeared to be architectural magazines. A framed photograph on the mantelpiece caught Marcus's attention, a younger Dr. Taylor with his arm around a beautiful woman with features that clearly contributed to Elijah's appearance. She wore a white lab coat with a chemical engineering company's logo visible on the breast pocket. That's my mom, Elijah said, noticing Marcus's interest as he returned with his notebook. She died when I was 3. I'm sorry, Marcus said sincerely. Elijah nodded with the solemn acceptance of a child who had grown up with loss as a fact of life rather than a fresh wound. Dad says she was brilliant. She designed special materials for medical equipment. Before they could discuss further, Dr. Taylor returned with an older woman who had a warm, no-nonsense demeanor. Mr. Johnson, this is Mrs. Garcia, our neighbor and Elijah's after-school guardian, Dr. Taylor introduced. She's also an exceptional cook who keeps us from surviving on takeout. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Garcia said, her slight accent suggesting Puerto Rican heritage. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Dr. Taylor, there's time for you to change if you wish. Thank you, Mrs. Garcia, Dr. Taylor replied. Mr. Johnson, would you like to freshen up before dinner? The guest bathroom is just down the hall. Marcus accepted the offer gratefully. In the privacy of the elegant bathroom, he took the opportunity to wash his face and hands thoroughly, combing his beard and hair with the small comb he carried. His reflection in the ornate mirror showed a man who still carried himself with dignity despite circumstances that had stripped away almost everything else. He had made similar preparations at the shelter that morning, but the contrast between his worn clothing and the Taylor home's luxury was unavoidable. Still, he reminded himself, Dr. Taylor had invited him knowing his situation. The doctor had seen something in him beyond his current circumstances, a recognition of the professional he had once been and in many ways still was. When Marcus returned to the living room, he found Dr. Taylor had changed from his formal suit to casual but clearly expensive clothing. The doctor was pouring what appeared to be sparkling water into crystal glasses. I hope you don't mind, Dr. Taylor said, offering Marcus a glass. I don't keep alcohol in the house. I appreciate that, Marcus replied honestly. Alcohol had been a destructive force in his descent after losing his family, and though he had been sober for years now, the absence of temptation was welcome. Dinner was served in a formal dining room that somehow managed to feel both elegant and comfortable. Mrs. Garcia had prepared a magnificent meal of roast chicken with rosemary, garlic mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables. The food was simple but perfectly executed, the kind of meal that nourished both body and spirit. Throughout dinner, the conversation flowed naturally between professional topics and Elijah's school activities. Dr. Taylor asked thoughtful questions about Marcus's engineering background, while Elijah eagerly shared details about his classes and the upcoming science fair. Mr. Johnson explained base isolation better than my science teacher, Elijah announced, spooning more vegetables onto his plate at Mrs. Garcia's silent prompting. He said buildings can float on special bearings during an earthquake. Is that right? Dr. Taylor asked, looking genuinely interested. Marcus nodded. That's a simplified explanation, but essentially correct. Modern base isolation systems allow a structure to move independently from ground motion during seismic events. Like boats on water, Elijah added. That's what Mr. Johnson said. As the meal progressed, Marcus found himself relaxing slightly. The Taylor family's hospitality was genuine, with no hint of the condescension or awkward charity he had sometimes encountered. Dr. Taylor treated him as an intellectual equal, while Elijah's admiration was refreshingly uncomplicated by awareness of social barriers. After dinner, Mrs. Garcia insisted on handling the cleanup alone, waving off offers of assistance from both Dr. Taylor and Marcus. She's remarkably independent, Dr. Taylor explained as they moved to the study where Elijah had set up his project materials. She's been a godsend since my wife passed away, but she has very definite ideas about her domain. The study was a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and featuring a large desk with a computer workstation. On a side table, Elijah had arranged his science project materials, foam board, craft sticks, clay, springs, and various weights for testing. I tried to start building last night, Elijah admitted, but I couldn't get the base isolation concept right. For the next hour, Marcus guided Elijah through the process of constructing a simple but effective model demonstrating earthquake-resistant building techniques. Dr. Taylor observed with evident appreciation, occasionally asking questions that showed his own engagement with the topic. As they worked, Marcus found himself falling into the familiar role of mentor, explaining concepts, demonstrating techniques, encouraging independent problem-solving. It felt remarkably natural, this sharing of knowledge with a bright young mind. For brief moments, he could almost forget the chasm between the life he once had and his current reality. Eventually, with the basic model constructed, Elijah began to show signs of fatigue, though he clearly wanted to continue. I think that's enough for tonight, Dr. Taylor said gently. It's getting late and tomorrow is a school day. Elijah reluctantly agreed, carefully setting the partial model aside for future work. After saying goodnight to Marcus with sincere thanks, he headed upstairs to prepare for bed. Once Elijah had gone, Dr. Taylor invited Marcus back to the living room. I hope you don't mind staying a bit longer. There's something I'd like to discuss with you, Marcus followed, sensing a shift in the evening's tone. As they settled into the comfortable seating, Dr. Taylor regarded him thoughtfully. I want to thank you again for what you did for Elijah, he began. Not just intervening with those bullies, but taking the time to share your knowledge with him. He's always been academically advanced, which unfortunately makes him a target sometimes. He's an exceptional child, Marcus replied honestly. His understanding of complex concepts is remarkable for his age. Dr. Taylor nodded. He takes after his mother in that regard. Catherine was a brilliant chemical engineer we met when she was developing specialized polymers for neurosurgical applications. A shadow of old grief crossed his face briefly. After she died, I worried about Elijah having proper intellectual stimulation. My schedule doesn't allow me to be as present as I'd like. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Mr. Johnson, Marcus, if I may, I hope you won't find this presumptuous, but I feel I need to address the obvious question. Marcus tensed slightly but nodded. Of course. How did someone with your credentials and experience end up in your current situation? Dr. Taylor asked directly but without judgment. The Marcus Johnson whose work I've read and admired had a distinguished career that many engineers would envy. Marcus had anticipated this question since the moment Dr. Taylor recognized his name. He had developed various abbreviated explanations over the years, depending on who was asking and why. But something about the doctor's straightforward approach, coupled with the respect he had shown throughout the evening, prompted a more complete response. It began with the accident, Marcus said, his voice steady but quieter than before. A drunk driver ran a red light. My wife and daughter were killed instantly. I was in the back seat, survived with relatively minor injuries, physically at least. Dr. Taylor's expression showed genuine empathy, the look of someone who understood profound loss firsthand. The grief, it consumed me, Marcus continued. I returned to work too soon, thinking it would help to focus on something else. Instead, I made critical errors in judgment, nothing catastrophic. My colleagues caught the mistakes, but enough to raise concerns. When I realized what was happening, I took a leave of absence. He paused, gathering himself. During that time, I started drinking. Not dramatically, not publicly, just enough to numb the pain each night, but it escalated. By the time my leave ended, I was functioning during the day but dependent at night. Dr. Taylor listened without interruption, his expression attentive and non-judgmental. I managed for nearly a year before it came to a head, Marcus continued. I showed up intoxicated to a critical client meeting, was terminated the same day. The firm was generous with severance, but I wasn't in a state to manage it wisely. He took a slow breath. Without work as an anchor, the drinking worsened. I depleted my savings, then my retirement funds, lost my home to foreclosure, stayed with friends until I exhausted their patience. Eventually, there was nowhere left to go but the streets. And yet you're sober now, Dr. Taylor observed quietly. Marcus nodded. 3 years, 8 months, and 14 days. I hit bottom, nearly died of exposure one winter night. A veterans outreach worker found me, got me into a program. By then, though, the professional damage was done. Employment gaps, no recent references, no permanent address, each application ends the same way. Dr. Taylor was silent for a moment, absorbing the story. Have you approached your former colleagues, someone who knew your work before? A few, Marcus acknowledged. Most were sympathetic but unwilling to take the risk. One offered janitorial work at his firm, well-intentioned, but he didn't need to complete the thought. But not recognizing your true value, Dr. Taylor finished. Exactly. Dr. Taylor leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Marcus, I'm going to be direct with you. The hospital's expansion project is currently stalled because our lead engineering consultant withdrew unexpectedly, accepted a position overseas. The preliminary plans you reviewed today are, as you identified, inadequate in several critical areas. He paused, then continued with careful precision. We need someone with specific expertise in disaster-resistant medical facility design to review and potentially revise the existing plans. The board has been struggling to find a suitable replacement on short notice. Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken, sensing where this might be heading but hardly daring to believe it. I would like to propose you for a consulting position, Dr. Taylor stated. Initially on a limited basis to assess the current plans, with potential for expanded involvement if your recommendations prove valuable, which based on what I've seen today I have no doubt they will. The offer hung in the air between them, so unexpected and yet so perfectly aligned with Marcus's expertise that it momentarily left him speechless. I appreciate the consideration, Marcus finally said, careful to maintain his composure. But there are practical concerns. My current circumstances would be addressed, Dr. Taylor interrupted gently. We have a guest house that's currently unoccupied. You would have private accommodations for the duration of the initial consultation period with access to necessary resources. Marcus struggled to process the offer. It represented everything he had hoped for: professional recognition, meaningful work, a chance to rebuild, yet the speed with which it had appeared seemed almost unreal. Why? He asked finally. Why take this risk on someone in my position? Dr. Taylor considered the question seriously. 3 reasons, he replied. First, practical necessity. We genuinely need someone with your specific expertise and quickly. Second, what I witnessed today, your immediate identification of critical flaws that our previous consultants missed entirely. And third, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Because 20 years ago, I was a promising medical student who nearly lost everything to addiction after my father's death. Someone took a chance on me when others wouldn't. Sometimes, Marcus, opportunity and redemption arrive in the same package. The revelation created a new dimension to their interaction, not just professional recognition, but a deeper understanding between two men who had faced their own versions of the abyss. I don't want charity, Marcus said after a moment. This isn't charity, Dr. Taylor assured him firmly. It's a business decision based on observed expertise. The hospital needs exactly what you can provide. Your circumstances are irrelevant to that fact. Marcus considered the offer, turning it over in his mind like an architectural model being examined from every angle. The board might have concerns about my background. The chairman of our board spent 3 years homeless in his youth, Dr. Taylor replied. Thomas believes strongly in second chances backed by demonstrated ability. He'll support my recommendation if your initial assessment proves valuable. The possibility of legitimate professional work, of applying his knowledge to something meaningful, was almost overwhelming after years of struggle. Marcus thought of the drawings he'd examined earlier, of the lives that could depend on proper facility design during a disaster. I would need access to current design software, he said, beginning to think practically, and my certification has lapsed. Those are details we can address, Dr. Taylor said, a smile beginning to form as he recognized Marcus's shift toward considering the offer seriously. What I need to know is, are you willing to try? Marcus thought of the years spent on park benches and in shelters, of the countless rejections and dismissals, of the daily struggle to maintain dignity in the face of society's assumptions. He thought, too, of the moment earlier today when he had examined those blueprints and immediately seen what needed to be done, the clarity and purpose that had flooded back into his mind. Yes, he said finally, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Yes, I'm willing to try. Dr. Taylor extended his hand, and this time the handshake represented not just social courtesy but the sealing of a pact, an opportunity offered and accepted, a potential turning point for both men. Excellent, Dr. Taylor said with genuine pleasure. We can discuss the details tomorrow. For tonight, the guest house is available if you'd like to stay, or if you prefer to maintain your own arrangements initially, I understand. The offer of immediate accommodation was tempting, especially with rain in the forecast, but Marcus felt a need to process the evening's developments on his own terms. I appreciate the offer, but I have some personal items at the community center I should collect, he said. Perhaps tomorrow would be better for the guest house. Dr. Taylor nodded, respecting the decision. Of course, shall we say 9 tomorrow morning? I can have a car pick you up wherever is convenient. They settled the arrangements, and soon Marcus found himself standing on the brownstone steps as Dr. Taylor called a car service. Despite his insistence that he could make his own way back to the community center, the doctor had been firm. The least he could do was ensure safe transportation. As they waited for the car to arrive, Dr. Taylor regarded Marcus thoughtfully. I've had a remarkable impact on Elijah in just a few days. He hasn't shown this much enthusiasm for anything since before his mother died. He's a special child, Marcus replied honestly. Brilliant mind, good heart, you've raised him well under difficult circumstances. I've done my best, Dr. Taylor acknowledged. But he needs more than I can provide alone: intellectual mentorship, male role models beyond just his father. Your guidance with this project has been invaluable to him. The car arrived before Marcus could formulate a response to the implied future role in Elijah's life. As he prepared to depart, Dr. Taylor handed him a business card with private contact information handwritten on the back. Until tomorrow, the doctor said, extending his hand one final time. Marcus shook it firmly, feeling a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. Until tomorrow. As the car pulled away from the elegant brownstone, Marcus gazed back at the Taylor home, warm light spilling from its windows, a father and son visible in silhouette. For the first time in 5 long years, he allowed himself to imagine a future different from the grinding present he had come to accept. Whether this opportunity would prove to be the turning point he had stopped hoping for remained to be seen. But for tonight, as the car carried him toward the community center where he would gather his few possessions, Marcus Johnson permitted himself something that had become foreign to his careful existence: anticipation. The community center was quiet when Marcus arrived, most residents already settled into their assigned cots for the night. Sister Bernadette looked up from her desk with surprise as he entered. Marcus. I was concerned when you didn't arrive for the evening check-in, she said, her practical face showing genuine relief. Everything all right, better than all right, Marcus replied, still processing the evening's developments himself. I may have a consulting opportunity, engineering work. Sister Bernadette's expression brightened. That's wonderful news. The kind of opportunity you've been waiting for. It's preliminary, Marcus cautioned, not wanting to overstate the situation. But yes, it could be significant. As he gathered his few possessions from the small locker assigned to him, Marcus explained the day's events in measured terms. Sister Bernadette listened attentively, her experienced eyes evaluating this unexpected development with the same careful assessment she applied to all matters concerning those in her care. This Dr. Taylor, she said when he had finished, he seems to recognize your value. He does, Marcus acknowledged, though I'm still not entirely certain why he's willing to take this chance. Sister Bernadette smiled knowingly. Sometimes people recognize in others what they've experienced themselves. You said he mentioned his own struggles? Marcus nodded, folding his spare shirt carefully. Briefly, he overcame addiction in his younger years. Then he understands that circumstances don't define capability, she observed, helping Marcus organize his documents, identification, military discharge papers, and educational credentials which he kept in a waterproof folder. When will you start? Tomorrow morning, Marcus replied. He's offered temporary housing in their guest house while I evaluate the project. Sister Bernadette's eyebrows rose slightly. Moving quickly, isn't he? Must be an urgent matter. The hospital expansion is behind schedule and their previous consultant left unexpectedly. Marcus closed his backpack, now containing everything he owned in the world. I've agreed to an initial assessment only. We'll see where it leads. The nun nodded, her practical nature asserting itself. Will you need anything? Professional clothes, perhaps? Marcus had been considering this very question. The community closet had a decent suit in my size last week. Is it still available? It is, Sister Bernadette confirmed. A bit dated but good quality. I had it cleaned and set aside, thinking it might be useful for your interviews. Her foresight touched Marcus deeply. This small act of faith, preserving a suitable garment in anticipation of an opportunity that had seemed increasingly unlikely, spoke volumes about her belief in his potential. Thank you, he said simply. Sister Bernadette waved away his gratitude. That's what we're here for. Now would you like to stay tonight, or are you heading elsewhere? I'll stay, Marcus decided. One last night to process everything before tomorrow. Later, lying on the familiar cot in the darkened dormitory, Marcus stared at the ceiling, his mind working through the remarkable developments of the day. From his confrontation with the security guard to the unexpected dinner at the Taylor home to the consulting offer, it was almost too much to absorb. Professional questions filled his thoughts. How much had hospital engineering standards changed in the 5 years since he'd practiced? Would his knowledge base require significant updating? Could he truly deliver value to the hospital project after such an extended absence from the field? Beyond the technical considerations lay more personal concerns. Could he successfully navigate the professional environment after years on the margins of society? How would the hospital board react to his background? Was he setting himself up for disappointment if this opportunity proved temporary? Sleep came eventually, but it was light and restless, filled with dreams of buildings that shifted between magnificent structures and precarious shelters. Morning arrived with the community center's usual routine: early breakfast, shared bathroom facilities, the controlled chaos of dozens of people preparing for their day with limited resources. Marcus moved through it with mechanical efficiency, showering thoroughly and shaving with particular care using the disposable razor provided by the center. Sister Bernadette had already retrieved the suit from storage when he emerged. It was indeed dated in style, perhaps 10 years old, but well-made and in excellent condition. The navy fabric showed minimal wear, and though it hung somewhat loosely on his frame, thinned by years of inconsistent nutrition, it transformed his appearance considerably. Look at you, Sister Bernadette said approvingly as he emerged from the changing area. Every inch the professional. Marcus adjusted the suit jacket, feeling both familiar and strange in formal attire after so long. It feels like wearing someone else's skin. It's your skin, she corrected firmly. Just one you haven't worn for a while. At precisely 8:45 a.m., Marcus stepped outside the community center, professional documents secured in a folder borrowed from the center's job resource room. The same car service from the previous night arrived punctually at 9, the driver making no indication that he recognized Marcus from before. Though now, dressed in a suit rather than worn casual clothing, the contrast was significant. The drive to the Taylor residence passed in silence, Marcus using the time to mentally review structural engineering principles and current building codes. The professional knowledge remained intact in his mind, like a well-constructed building that had weathered a storm, dusty perhaps, but with its foundation and framework solid. Dr. Taylor was waiting on the steps of his brownstone, dressed in a crisp suit and checking his watch as the car pulled up. His expression showed approval at Marcus's transformed appearance. "Good morning," he greeted as Marcus exited the vehicle. "I see you found appropriate attire." "Community resources," Marcus explained, "though I may need to supplement if this extends beyond the initial consultation." Dr. Taylor nodded. "We'll address that if necessary. Coffee before we head to the hospital." Mrs. Garcia made a fresh pot. Inside, the Taylor home was quiet, Elijah having already left for school. Mrs. Garcia provided coffee in fine porcelain cups, along with freshly baked pastries that reminded Marcus how long it had been since he'd enjoyed such simple luxuries. "I've scheduled a meeting with Walter Chen, our facilities director, at 10, Dr. Taylor explained as they sat in the kitchen. "He's aware I'm bringing in a consulting engineer for an initial assessment but doesn't know your specific circumstances." Marcus appreciated the doctor's discretion. "What exactly have you told him about me?" "That you're a structural engineer with specialized experience in medical facility design, particularly disaster-resistant construction," Dr. Taylor replied. "That you've consulted on major hospital projects including San Francisco General and Loma Linda, all factual statements." Marcus nodded, grateful for the straightforward approach. "And the board?" "Thomas Bennett, the chairman, is aware of the general situation," Dr. Taylor said. "As I mentioned, he has personal experience with homelessness in his youth and believes strongly in second chances. The rest of the board will evaluate based on the quality of your assessment." It was a fair arrangement, recognition of his expertise while acknowledging the unusual circumstances. Marcus sipped his coffee, already formulating his approach to the evaluation. "Before we leave," Dr. Taylor continued, "I'd like to show you the guest house. It's where Catherine's parents stayed when visiting, but it's been vacant since they moved to Florida last year. The guest house was a converted carriage house behind the main residence, small but elegant, with a bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, and small living area. The space was immaculately maintained, with simple but high-quality furnishings. There's Wi-Fi, of course, Dr. Taylor explained, showing Marcus the information card with the network details. Basic provisions in the refrigerator, laundry facilities in the basement of the main house. Please consider it yours for the duration of the consultation. Marcus surveyed the space with mixed emotions. After years of shelters and outdoor sleeping arrangements, the private accommodations seemed almost overwhelming in their comfort and security. This is more than generous, he said quietly. It's practical, Dr. Taylor countered. You'll need a suitable environment to work effectively. Now shall we head to the hospital? Walter is expecting us. The morning meeting with the facility's director went better than Marcus had anticipated. Walter Chen was a pragmatic professional who cared more about competence than personal history. He provided comprehensive documentation of the expansion project, including the complete architectural plans, engineering assessments, and equipment specifications. Our timeline is already compromised, Chen explained as they reviewed the materials in a conference room. Carrington, our previous engineering consultant, accepted a position in Dubai with 2 days' notice, leaving us without specialized structural oversight. The board is concerned about both safety compliance and budget implications of the delay. What's your primary concern with the current design? Marcus asked, already reviewing the detailed plans with a practiced eye. Integration of the advanced imaging suite with the structural requirements for seismic resilience, Chen replied promptly. The MRI equipment requires extraordinarily precise stability, but the foundation design doesn't adequately address potential movement during seismic events. Marcus nodded, noting that his initial assessment from the previous day aligned with Chen's concerns. The current isolation system is inadequate, he confirmed. I'd need to review the geotechnical reports and equipment specifications in detail, but I suspect we'll need to redesign the foundation entirely. Chen looked simultaneously concerned and relieved, worried about the implications but grateful for clear direction. How long would an assessment take? To provide a preliminary evaluation with specific recommendations? 3 days, Marcus replied confidently. A complete redesign would be more extensive, of course. Dr. Taylor, who had been observing quietly, nodded with satisfaction. That sounds reasonable. Walter, can you ensure Mr. Johnson has access to all necessary documentation and systems? Of course, Chen agreed. We can set up a temporary office immediately. Our design software is cloud-based, so access can be arranged without delay. The rest of the morning passed in a flurry of practical arrangements: security clearance, system access, workspace allocation. By noon, Marcus found himself installed in a small but well-equipped office within the facilities department, complete with a computer configured for architectural and engineering applications. As Chen demonstrated the software interface, Marcus noted with relief that the programs were updated versions of those he had used previously. The interfaces had evolved, but the fundamental functions remained familiar. I'll leave you to get acquainted with the systems, Chen said eventually. Dr. Taylor suggested you might prefer to work independently initially. Once alone, Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the opportunity before him. 5 years had passed since he had practiced his profession in any formal capacity. Now, surrounded by the tools of his trade and tasked with a critical assessment, the moment of truth had arrived. He began methodically, reviewing the geotechnical reports first, the literal foundation upon which all structural decisions would rest. The site presented significant challenges: varying soil conditions, a high water table, and moderate seismic risk. The previous design had attempted to address these factors, but had compromised critical aspects to accommodate budget constraints. Marcus documented each issue meticulously, creating a structured analysis that identified problems and proposed specific solutions. The work absorbed him completely, the hours passing unnoticed as he immersed himself in the familiar world of load calculations, material specifications, and structural modeling. At 4 o'clock, a knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Dr. Taylor entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might need this, he said, placing 1 cup beside Marcus's keyboard. How's it going? Marcus straightened, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. Better than expected, he admitted. The software is more advanced than what I used previously, but the fundamentals haven't changed. I've identified several critical issues in the foundation design that will need addressing. Dr. Taylor nodded, scanning the multiple screens displaying complex structural models and calculations. You seem quite at home with the systems for someone who's been away from the field for 5 years. Engineering principles don't change, Marcus replied, just the tools for applying them. He pointed to one of the displays. The primary issue is that they've specified a traditional isolation system that won't accommodate the precision requirements of the new imaging equipment. I'm outlining an alternative approach using a hybrid system that provides both macro and micro isolation. Dr. Taylor studied the display, his expression thoughtful. You've accomplished more in a few hours than Carrington did in weeks. Marcus shrugged slightly. Fresh perspective perhaps, or maybe more specialized experience with this particular type of facility. Or simply superior expertise, Dr. Taylor suggested. He checked his watch. I have surgery scheduled until late this evening. Will you be all right finding your way back to the guest house? Of course, Marcus assured him, though I'd like to continue working for a few more hours if that's acceptable. Stay as long as you need, Dr. Taylor replied. Your building access is active 24/7. Just keep track of your hours for proper compensation. The concept of payment, of professional compensation for his expertise hit Marcus with unexpected force. Throughout the day, he had been so focused on proving his capabilities that the practical implications had remained secondary. We haven't discussed compensation, he noted, suddenly aware of this significant oversight. Standard consulting rates for your level of expertise, Dr. Taylor said matter-of-factly. Walter has the paperwork ready whenever you're prepared to formalize the arrangement. For now, consider this a paid evaluation period. After Dr. Taylor departed, Marcus returned to his analysis with renewed focus. By 8 o'clock that evening, he had compiled a comprehensive preliminary assessment identifying 5 critical deficiencies in the current design along with proposed solutions for each. The security guard who had been skeptical of Marcus the previous day now nodded respectfully as he exited the building, his transformation from homeless man to consulting engineer apparently complete in the guard's perception based solely on his changed appearance and official hospital badge. Marcus walked the short distance to the Taylor residence, the evening air crisp with early autumn. The guest house lights had been left on, welcoming him to a space that was, temporarily at least, his own. Inside, he discovered that someone, presumably Mrs. Garcia, had stocked the refrigerator with simple but high-quality food. A note on the counter provided instructions for the heating system and other amenities. After a simple meal, Marcus stood in the center of the small living area, absorbing the profound shift in his circumstances. 24 hours earlier, he had been preparing to spend the night in a community center dormitory, his professional identity a painful memory. Now he stood in private accommodations, his expertise not only recognized but actively sought. The whiplash of transition left him both grateful and uneasy. Experience had taught him that dramatic improvements could reverse just as dramatically. Hope was dangerous precisely because it opened one to the pain of disappointment. A text message interrupted his thoughts, Dr. Taylor checking that he had found everything satisfactory in the guest house. The simple courtesy reinforced the doctor's genuine concern for his welfare. The following day established a pattern that would continue through the week. Marcus arrived at the hospital early, worked intensively on his evaluation, and conferred with Walter Chen on technical matters when necessary. Dr. Taylor checked in periodically but maintained professional distance, allowing Marcus to establish his own relationships within the facility's department. By the third day, Marcus had completed his comprehensive assessment, a 30-page report detailing specific deficiencies in the current design along with proposed solutions, cost implications, and implementation timelines. The document reflected not just technical expertise but strategic thinking about practical constraints and operational requirements. Walter Chen reviewed the report with increasing appreciation as he worked through its contents. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "You've addressed issues we hadn't even identified yet with solutions that actually reduce costs in several areas. The previous design relied too heavily on proprietary systems," Marcus explained. "Custom solutions are sometimes necessary, but often standard approaches can be adapted more cost-effectively." Chen nodded thoughtfully. "The board meets tomorrow morning. Dr. Taylor has requested that you present your findings directly." The prospect of presenting to the hospital board, essentially auditioning for continued involvement with the project, triggered Marcus's first significant wave of anxiety since beginning the consultation. These would be influential individuals with the power to either extend this opportunity or end it. "I'll prepare a presentation," he said, maintaining a calm exterior despite his concern. That evening, as Marcus worked late finalizing his presentation materials, a knock at his office door revealed Thomas Bennett, the hospital board chairman Dr. Taylor had mentioned previously. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Bennett said, entering without waiting for a response. The man was in his 60s with the weathered face of someone who had experienced both hardship and success. His suit was impeccable, but his demeanor lacked the polished smoothness typical of lifelong privilege. "Just finishing up," Marcus replied, standing to greet the chairman. Bennett waved him back to his seat. Please continue your work. I just wanted to introduce myself before tomorrow's meeting. He settled into a chair across from Marcus's desk. Richard, Dr. Taylor has spoken highly of your assessment. I've identified several critical issues that need addressing, Marcus acknowledged cautiously. Bennett nodded, studying Marcus with shrewd eyes. Richard also mentioned your personal circumstances. Hope you don't mind. Marcus tensed slightly but maintained his professional composure. It's relevant context for evaluating my involvement with the project. Is it? Bennett questioned, raising an eyebrow. I'm more concerned with whether that foundation design will keep our $100 million imaging equipment properly isolated during an earthquake than where you've been sleeping for the past few years. The blunt statement caught Marcus off guard. Most would consider it relevant. Bennett leaned forward, his expression intensifying. Let me tell you what's relevant, Mr. Johnson. When I was 17, my father lost his job, then drank himself to death within a year. My mother couldn't cope, ended up institutionalized. I spent 3 years living on the streets of Chicago before a community college professor recognized I had a head for numbers and helped me get an education. The chairman's forthrightness about his own history created an unexpected connection. Dr. Taylor mentioned you had some personal experience with homelessness. That's putting it mildly, Bennett confirmed with a short laugh. Spent my teens eating from dumpsters and sleeping in abandoned buildings. Now I run one of the largest healthcare investment firms in the country and chair this hospital board. He fixed Marcus with a penetrating gaze. So when Richard brought your situation to my attention, along with your exceptional qualifications, I wasn't inclined to judge based on circumstances. I appreciate that perspective, Marcus said sincerely. That said, Bennett continued, his tone sharpening, this isn't charity. This hospital serves thousands of patients. The expansion project has significant safety implications. If your work isn't excellent, your background won't matter. Homelessness, addiction recovery, none of it. You'll be thanked for your initial assessment and sent on your way. I wouldn't want it any other way, Marcus replied with equal directness. Bennett studied him for a moment longer, then nodded with apparent satisfaction. Good, I've reviewed your preliminary report. It's impressive, but some board members will have questions tomorrow, tough ones. They'll want to know why we should trust someone who's been out of the field for 5 years. A reasonable concern, Marcus acknowledged. I've asked myself the same question. And your answer, Marcus considered carefully before responding. Engineering isn't just about current software or recent projects. It's about fundamental principles and the ability to apply them to complex problems. My understanding of those principles remains intact. The specific applications may have evolved, but my capacity to learn and adapt hasn't diminished. Bennett seemed to approve of this response. Some will also question your reliability given your history. Also reasonable, Marcus admitted. I can only point to my sobriety maintained under far more challenging circumstances than I'm facing now and to the quality of the work I've produced this week. Fair enough. Bennett stood, preparing to leave. One last question, Mr. Johnson. If the board approves your continued involvement with this project, what would you hope to achieve beyond the professional deliverables? The question penetrated to Marcus's deeper motivations, requiring honest self-reflection. Reclamation, he said finally, of my professional identity, of my ability to contribute meaningfully, of my place in the community. Bennett nodded slowly, a flicker of recognition passing across his features. I'll see you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Be prepared for scrutiny, but know that you have at least one ally on that board. He extended his hand, which Marcus shook firmly. Perhaps two, counting Richard. After Bennett departed, Marcus returned to finalizing his presentation with renewed purpose. The chairman's visit had been enlightening, both a warning of the challenges ahead and an unexpected affirmation that his path back to professional standing, while difficult, might not be impossible. The following morning, Marcus arrived at the hospital's administrative wing dressed in his community center suit, now professionally cleaned and pressed thanks to Mrs. Garcia's assistance. He carried a slim portfolio containing additional notes and reference materials, though his formal presentation had been loaded into the boardroom system the previous evening. Dr. Taylor met him outside the boardroom, his expression encouraging but appropriately professional for the setting. Ready? He asked simply. As ready as I'll ever be, Marcus replied, squaring his shoulders. The boardroom was impressive, a large space dominated by a polished conference table surrounded by 12 executive chairs. Various hospital administrators and board members were already seated, engaged in pre-meeting discussions. Thomas Bennett occupied the chair at the head of the table, reviewing documents with focused attention. As Marcus entered alongside Dr. Taylor, conversations quieted, and multiple pairs of eyes assessed him with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. He recognized the weight of the moment. These first impressions would significantly impact his prospects. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Taylor announced as they reached the front of the room, this is Marcus Johnson, the structural engineering consultant who has been evaluating our expansion project this week. As you've seen from his preliminary report, he's identified several critical issues that require our attention. Bennett gestured to an empty seat. Mr. Johnson, please join us. We're eager to hear your assessment directly. As Marcus took his place and prepared to present his findings, he felt a complex mixture of nervousness and confidence. The past week had reminded him of his capabilities, of the professional expertise that remained intact despite years of personal struggle. Whether this opportunity would extend beyond today remained uncertain. But in this moment, he was once again Marcus Johnson, structural engineer, applying his knowledge to solve complex problems. The presentation itself passed in a blur of technical discussion, pointed questions, and detailed explanations. Some board members were clearly skeptical of both his findings and his qualifications, while others seemed impressed by the thoroughness of his analysis. Throughout, Marcus maintained professional composure, neither defensive when challenged nor overly eager to prove himself. By the conclusion of the 90-minute session, he had addressed every technical question raised, clarified his recommendations, and outlined a possible path forward for the project. Whether it would be enough to secure continued involvement remained to be seen. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," Bennett said as the presentation concluded. "Would you mind stepping outside while the board discusses next steps? Dr. Taylor will join you shortly." In the hallway outside the boardroom, Marcus paced slowly, reviewing his performance. He had covered all the essential points, maintained professional demeanor throughout, and demonstrated clear expertise. If the decision went against him, it wouldn't be for lack of capability or preparation. 20 minutes later, the boardroom door opened and Dr. Taylor emerged, his expression carefully neutral until the door closed behind him. "Well?" Marcus asked, unable to read the doctor's controlled demeanor. Dr. Taylor's face broke into a genuine smile. "They were impressed, Marcus, very impressed. The board has unanimously approved your continued involvement as lead structural consultant for the redesign phase." The news hit Marcus with unexpected force. "Unanimously, even the skeptics." "Even them," Dr. Taylor confirmed. "Your technical expertise was simply too compelling to dismiss." The board has authorized a 3-month consulting contract initially, with evaluation for potential extension at that point. Marcus absorbed this information carefully, aware that this represented not just professional opportunity but potential life transformation. "And the housing situation? The guest house is yours for the duration of the contract," Dr. Taylor assured him. "Additionally, the hospital will provide an advance on your consulting fees to address immediate needs, appropriate clothing, personal items, whatever you require to work effectively." The comprehensive support was more than Marcus had dared hope for, not charity, but practical assistance tied directly to professional performance. "I don't know how to thank you properly," he said quietly. "You already have," Dr. Taylor replied, "by confirming my assessment of your capabilities. This outcome benefits the hospital as much as it does you." He checked his watch. "I have surgeries scheduled this afternoon, but Walter will handle the contract details." "And Marcus," he added, his tone softening slightly, "Elijah has been asking when you might help him with his science project again. Perhaps this weekend, if you're available." The mention of Elijah's project, the catalyst for this unexpected chain of events, brought the situation full circle. "I'd be happy to help him," Marcus agreed, feeling a surprising warmth at the prospect of continuing to mentor the bright young boy whose path had so unexpectedly crossed with his own. As Dr. Taylor departed for his surgical duties, Marcus stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, processing the remarkable turn his life had taken in less than a week. From a park bench confrontation with a security guard to a professional consulting contract with a major hospital, the transition seemed almost surreal in its speed and scale. Yet he recognized the precarious nature of this opportunity. The contract was temporary, the housing arrangement contingent, the professional redemption still tentative. The path ahead would require not just technical expertise but consistent reliability and performance. As he made his way to Walter Chen's office to formalize the consulting arrangement, Marcus maintained the cautious optimism that had become his emotional survival strategy. This was not an ending but a beginning, a chance to rebuild what had been lost, one professional contribution at a time. What he could not yet fully appreciate was how this opportunity would expand beyond professional redemption to encompass a broader reconstruction of his life, including his unexpected role in the life of a brilliant young boy and his accomplished father. Two individuals whose own loss had created an opening for connection that none of them had anticipated. 6 months had passed since Marcus Johnson first stepped into the Massachusetts General Hospital boardroom to present his engineering assessment. The early December morning brought a light dusting of snow to Boston as Marcus stood before the mirror in what was no longer the guest house. but simply his residence for the foreseeable future. The man reflected in the mirror bore only passing resemblance to the homeless veteran who had intervened during a playground confrontation half a year earlier. Clean-shaven with a precise haircut, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored to his now healthier frame, Marcus looked every bit the professional engineer his business card declared him to be. On his desk sat the latest revision of the hospital's West Wing structural plans, the third iteration incorporating his specialized designs for seismic resilience and vibration isolation. The project had progressed from concept to active construction, with foundation work already underway based on his redesigned specifications. What had begun as a 3-month consulting contract had evolved into a permanent position as the hospital's lead structural engineering consultant, with responsibilities extending beyond the initial expansion project to include a comprehensive assessment of the existing facilities. The board, impressed by his technical expertise and methodical approach, had unanimously approved the extended engagement after reviewing the results of his initial work. Marcus gathered the presentation materials for this morning's construction team briefing, mentally reviewing the key points he needed to address about the specialized base isolation system being installed. As lead consultant, he now directed a team of junior engineers supplied by the hospital's contracted firm, professionals who initially viewed him with skepticism but quickly came to respect his knowledge and leadership. The transition had not been without challenges. During those first weeks, Marcus had battled imposter syndrome, half expecting someone to expose him as an interloper in the professional world he had once belonged to naturally. He'd worked excessive hours, double-checking every calculation and specification, determined that no oversight would jeopardize his precarious new position. Dr. Taylor had noticed this pattern and intervened with characteristic directness. "You were hired for your expertise, not your capacity for self-destruction through overwork," he had said during a frank conversation 3 months into the project. "Your value isn't measured in hours but in the quality of your contribution. The board isn't looking for martyrdom, Marcus. We need you functioning at your best." That conversation had marked a turning point in their professional relationship, which had evolved alongside a deepening personal connection. What began as gratitude and opportunity had developed into genuine friendship between two men who recognized in each other both excellence and the scars of personal struggle. A light knock at the door interrupted Marcus's thoughts. He opened it to find Elijah bundled in a winter coat, science project folder clutched in his mittened hands. "Morning, Mr. Johnson," the boy greeted him with characteristic enthusiasm. "Dad said you'd help me practice my presentation before school." "Indeed I did," Marcus confirmed, gesturing the boy inside. "Let me see what you've prepared." Over the past months, Marcus's mentorship of Elijah had become a regular part of both their lives. The earthquake-resistant building model they had constructed together had won first place in the school science fair, earning Elijah not just academic recognition, but more importantly to the formerly isolated child, the respect of his classmates. Building on that success, Elijah had developed increasingly sophisticated projects under Marcus's guidance, their sessions expanding from engineering principles to broader discussions of science, mathematics, and occasionally life lessons. Dr. Taylor had encouraged this relationship, recognizing how the boy thrived under the additional mentorship. "I've revised the introduction like you suggested," Elijah explained, spreading his materials across Marcus's small dining table. "And I added more detail about how tensegrity principles apply to both architecture and biological systems." Marcus reviewed the presentation with appropriate seriousness, offering specific feedback while acknowledging Elijah's impressive progress. "Structural analysis here is more sophisticated than some undergraduate work I've reviewed," he noted, indicating a particularly well-constructed explanation. Elijah beamed at the praise. "I read those textbooks you recommended, the college-level ones." "I noticed," Marcus replied with a smile. "Your understanding of force distribution is exceptional for someone your age." After 15 minutes of review and targeted suggestions, Marcus glanced at his watch. "Time for you to head to school. Your father's probably waiting." As if on cue, Dr. Taylor appeared at the door, car keys in hand. "Ready, gentlemen?" "Just finished," Marcus confirmed, helping Elijah gather his materials. "Thanks, Mr. Johnson," Elijah said, carefully placing his presentation in his backpack. "See you this weekend for the museum tour." "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus assured him. As Elijah headed toward the car, Dr. Taylor lingered briefly. "Construction meeting at 9, he confirmed. Marcus nodded. "I'm prepared. The foundation team has some questions about the isolation bearings that I need to address before installation continues." "Excellent." Dr. Taylor hesitated, then added, "Board dinner this Friday. Thomas specifically requested your attendance. I believe he wants to discuss expanding your role to include oversight of the satellite facility renovations. The news represented yet another expansion of Marcus's professional responsibilities and recognition. I'll be there, he confirmed. Dr. Taylor smiled with evident satisfaction. See you at the hospital. As the Taylors drove away, Marcus completed his preparation for the day ahead. The hospital car service would arrive in 20 minutes to transport him to the construction site, where he would lead the technical briefing for the specialized subcontractors installing the base isolation system he had designed. His life now operated with a structured precision that would have seemed impossible during those years on the streets. He maintained a savings account that grew steadily with each consulting payment. He had re-established contact with former colleagues, many of whom had responded with genuine pleasure at his professional return. He had even begun preliminary discussions with the State Engineering Board about reinstating his professional license, a process complicated by his extended absence from practice, but supported by strong recommendations from the hospital leadership. The car arrived precisely on schedule, the driver greeting Marcus with the respectful familiarity that had replaced the wariness of their early interactions. As they drove toward the hospital, Marcus reviewed his notes one final time, the technical details of bearing placement and isolation specifications flowing naturally through his mind. At the construction site adjacent to the main hospital, Marcus was immediately approached by the project manager and lead contractor, both deferring to his expertise regarding the specialized foundation system now being installed. Dr. Johnson, we've encountered an issue with the southeastern quadrant bearing placement. The contractor began, using the honorific that had been mistakenly applied to Marcus early in the project, and which he had stopped correcting after realizing it facilitated his authority with the construction teams. For the next hour, Marcus guided the team through a technical inspection, identifying the problem with the bearing alignment and developing an on-site solution that would maintain the system's integrity without delaying the construction schedule. His decisions were implemented without question, his expertise now established beyond any doubt. As the morning progressed to the formal team briefing, Marcus stood before 30 contractors and engineers, explaining the critical aspects of the specialized system with the confidence of someone who had never left the profession. The technical questions were incisive, the discussion productive, and the outcome precisely what the project required. By afternoon, Marcus had returned to his office in the hospital's facilities department to address documentation updates necessitated by the morning's field adjustments. Walter Chen stopped by to review progress, their professional relationship having evolved into one of mutual respect and occasional friendship. Beam delivery is scheduled for Thursday, Chen noted, reviewing the project timeline. Will you be on-site for placement verification? Absolutely, Marcus confirmed. The integrated damping system requires precise alignment with the isolation bearings. I'll supervise personally. Chen nodded, clearly satisfied. The board is extremely pleased with progress. Thomas mentioned you'll be joining the quarterly dinner on Friday. So I understand, Marcus replied. He doesn't invite consultants to those functions lightly, Chen observed. Usually just department heads and key leadership. The implication was clear. Marcus's position within the hospital's operational structure had evolved beyond his formal title. What had begun as a temporary consulting arrangement had transformed into an integral role that transcended conventional organizational boundaries. Late afternoon found Marcus in an unexpected location, the Boston Common, seated on the same bench where he had first encountered Elijah. The park looked different in winter dress, the playground emptier due to the cold, but the essential character remained unchanged. He had begun visiting this spot periodically, using the familiar environment to ground himself amid the rapid changes in his life. Today he had a specific purpose beyond reflection, a meeting arranged through Sister Bernadette with James, a formerly homeless veteran who had recently completed a technical certification program. Marcus spotted the man approaching hesitantly, recognizing the careful assessment of surroundings that became instinctive after extended periods on the streets. James was perhaps 40, with military posture despite his obvious nervousness. "Mr. Johnson?" he inquired as he reached the bench. "Marcus, please," Marcus replied, standing to shake the man's hand. "Thank you for meeting me." They sat and Marcus explained the purpose of the meeting directly. The hospital's facilities department has an opening for a CAD technician. The position requires the certification you've recently completed, basic technical drawing skills, and attention to detail. Sister Bernadette mentioned you have experience with architectural rendering from your military service. James nodded cautiously. 2 years as a draftsman with the Corps of Engineers, but that was before, he gestured vaguely, the implication clear, before whatever circumstances had led to his homelessness. I understand completely, Marcus assured him. 6 months ago, I was sleeping at the Second Chance shelter between nights by the river. Now I'm the structural engineering consultant for Massachusetts General Hospital. James's expression registered surprise, then cautious hope. Sister Bernadette mentioned something about that. I thought she might be exaggerating to motivate me. She wasn't, Marcus confirmed with a small smile. The path back isn't easy, but it exists. This position could be your first step if you're interested. I am, James said immediately. I've been trying to find technical work, but without recent experience or references. I'm familiar with that particular challenge, Marcus acknowledged. This opportunity comes with conditions, continued sobriety if that's been an issue, reliable attendance, quality work, but also with support, a decent starting salary, benefits after 90 days, and mentorship from me and others in the department. As they discussed the specifics, Marcus recognized in James the same combination of capability and circumstance that had characterized his own situation. The man clearly possessed the necessary skills, but had been prevented from applying them by the practical barriers homelessness created: lack of address, professional clothing, references, and most importantly, opportunity. Why are you doing this? James asked finally, the directness reflecting the suspicion that became habitual during life on the streets, where apparent generosity often carried hidden costs. Because someone did it for me, Marcus replied simply. And because talent shouldn't be wasted due to circumstance. By the end of their meeting, arrangements had been made for James to interview formally with Walter Chen the following week. Marcus provided specific guidance on preparation, documentation, and presentation, the practical knowledge he had gained during his own transition back to professional life. As James departed with renewed purpose in his step, Marcus remained on the bench, contemplating how profoundly his life had changed since that fateful afternoon when he had intervened to protect a bullied child. What had begun as a simple act of decency had cascaded into a complete reconstruction of his existence, professionally, personally, and communally. The winter sun was setting early as Marcus finally rose to leave the park. He had one more stop to make before returning to the guest house, the Second Chance shelter where he now served on the advisory board, leveraging his renewed professional connections to improve employment pathways for residents. Sister Bernadette greeted him warmly as he entered the familiar facility. How did the meeting with James go? She asked immediately, practical as always. Promising, Marcus replied. He has the technical skills for the position. Chen will make the final decision, but I'll be advocating for him. The nun nodded with satisfaction. That's 3 placements this month. Your program is gaining momentum. The program had begun informally, Marcus connecting shelter residents with entry-level positions at contractors and suppliers associated with the hospital project. It had evolved into a structured initiative, with skills assessment, targeted training, and graduated responsibility, all designed to create sustainable pathways out of homelessness through meaningful employment. The hospital board is discussing formal sponsorship, Marcus explained as they walked through the shelter. Thomas Bennett believes it aligns with their community engagement priorities while addressing their workforce development needs. Sister Bernadette smiled knowingly. Practical compassion, always more sustainable than mere charity. They discussed operational matters for the next 30 minutes, funding needs, candidate assessment, employer relationships. Marcus had discovered that his engineering mindset translated effectively to program development, approaching systemic problems with the same analytical rigor he applied to structural challenges. As he prepared to leave, Sister Bernadette handed him an envelope. This arrived for you today. I recognize the return address, Howard University's Engineering Department. Marcus accepted the envelope with mixture of anticipation and trepidation. He had applied for an adjunct teaching position in the structural engineering program, an opportunity to share his specialized knowledge with the next generation of engineers. After years of professional absence, he had been uncertain whether any academic institution would consider his application seriously. Aren't you going to open it? Sister Bernadette prompted. Marcus carefully opened the envelope and scanned the contents. They're offering me a position teaching advanced structural design for disaster-resistant infrastructure, he said quietly. 1 evening course per week beginning next semester. Sister Bernadette squeezed his arm gently. Another piece falls into place. As Marcus left the shelter, the weight of the acceptance letter in his pocket seemed to represent yet another step in his ongoing reconstruction. Teaching had never been part of his original career plan, but the opportunity to mentor young engineers appealed deeply to something that had awakened during his work with Elijah, a desire to share knowledge, to help others build their own foundations. The following evening found Marcus seated beside Dr. Taylor in the hospital's executive conference room, reviewing final design modifications for specialized operating suites in the new wing. Their professional collaboration had developed a comfortable rhythm, each recognizing and respecting the other's expertise. These vibration isolation specifications exceed industry standards, Dr. Taylor observed, studying the detailed plans. Is that necessary? For microsurgery applications? Absolutely, Marcus confirmed. The foundation system we've designed can mitigate major seismic events, but these operating suites need protection from even minor vibrations during delicate procedures. The incremental cost is justified by the potential impact on surgical outcomes. Dr. Taylor nodded, accepting the assessment. Speaking of outcomes, he said, changing the subject, Elijah received his advanced placement test results yesterday. And, Marcus prompted, genuinely interested. Perfect scores in mathematics and science, Dr. Taylor reported with evident pride. The school is recommending an accelerated curriculum with mentorship components. They specifically mentioned his science fair projects as evidence of his advanced conceptual understanding. He's an exceptional student, Marcus acknowledged. His intuitive grasp of structural principles is remarkable. It's not just his academic aptitude that's flourishing, Dr. Taylor added more quietly. His social confidence has improved dramatically in recent months. The success of the projects you've guided him through has changed how his peers perceive him. More importantly, it's changed how he perceives himself. The observation resonated with Marcus's own experience, how professional recognition had restored not just his circumstances but his fundamental sense of identity and value. Children and adults aren't so different in that regard, he noted. We all need to feel capable and respected in our communities. Dr. Taylor studied him thoughtfully. You've become important to him, beyond the academic mentorship. The statement carried weight that Marcus wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. He's a remarkable young man. It's been my privilege to work with him. He talks about you constantly, Dr. Taylor continued. Marcus says this, Marcus designed that, Marcus explained how. He paused, then added with careful precision, he hasn't connected with an adult male figure that way since his grandfather passed away 2 years ago. The implication hung in the air between them that Marcus had become more than a casual mentor in Elijah's life, that his presence had addressed a need beyond academic guidance. The recognition carried both satisfaction and responsibility. I'm honored by his regard, Marcus said simply, and committed to deserving it. Dr. Taylor nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. Now, he said, returning to the blueprints before them, tell me more about these specialized flooring materials you've specified for the imaging suite. The conversation returned to technical matters, but Marcus found himself reflecting on the broader dimensions of his reconstruction. What had begun as professional redemption had expanded to encompass community contribution and personal connection. The components of his renewed life were integrating into a coherent whole that seemed increasingly sustainable. Friday evening arrived with a light snowfall that blanketed Boston in pristine white. Marcus dressed carefully for the board dinner, selecting his newest suit, a charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes that Walter Chen's wife had helped him choose for exactly such occasions. The transformation in his appearance merely reflected the more profound changes in his circumstances and outlook. The dinner was held in a private room at one of Boston's finest restaurants, the kind of establishment Marcus had once frequented with clients, but had later walked past with the invisible status of homelessness. Now he entered with the confidence of belonging, greeted by name by hospital board members and administrators who had come to respect his expertise and value his contributions. Thomas Bennett approached as Marcus accepted a sparkling water from a passing server. Glad you could join us, the chairman said, his gruff manner unchanged by the formal setting. I've been reviewing your proposal for the satellite facility renovations. And, Marcus inquired, maintaining professional composure despite his interest in the chairman's assessment. Impressive analysis, Bennett acknowledged, particularly your identification of potential savings through integrated systems design. The board will be discussing formal approval next week, but I wanted you to know I'll be recommending we proceed with your approach. I appreciate your support, Marcus replied sincerely. Bennett waved away the gratitude. It's a sound business decision. Your work on the main facility expansion has already saved us millions while improving safety specifications. This isn't about personal favor, Johnson. It's about demonstrated value. This straightforward affirmation of his professional worth meant more to Marcus than any socially obligated praise. Nevertheless, the opportunity is significant and I recognize your role in providing it. Bennett studied him for a moment, then nodded with apparent approval. Richard mentioned you've been offered a teaching position at Howard. News travels fast, Marcus observed. Small community at the top of any field, Bennett replied with a shrug. Will you accept? I intend to, Marcus confirmed. The schedule is compatible with my hospital responsibilities, and I find I enjoy sharing knowledge with those who can apply it. Good, Bennett said decisively. The profession needs practitioners who understand both theory and practical application. Too many academics who have never solved real-world problems teaching students who then struggle in actual practice. The chairman's endorsement, like everything about the man, was practical rather than sentimental. One other matter, Bennett continued, lowering his voice slightly. I understand you've been developing an employment pathway program through that shelter you were connected with. Marcus nodded, surprised that this initiative had reached the chairman's attention. It's still in its early stages, he acknowledged. I want a formal proposal on my desk Monday, Bennett stated. The hospital's Community Engagement Committee has funding available for exactly this type of initiative. If the program is as well structured as I've heard, we should institutionalize it properly. The request represented yet another expansion of Marcus's impact from individual contribution to systemic change. I'll have it ready, he promised. Bennett nodded, then moved on to greet other attendees, his manner consistently direct regardless of whom he was addressing. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself engaged in multiple conversations about both technical matters and broader community initiatives. His expertise was sought, his opinions valued, his contributions recognized, all fundamental markers of professional standing and social reintegration. Dr. Taylor joined him as the formal dinner concluded and attendees gathered in smaller conversational groups. Productive evening? He inquired. Very, Marcus confirmed. And it wants to formalize the employment pathway program with hospital sponsorship. Excellent news, Dr. Taylor said with evident satisfaction. Though not surprising, Thomas recognizes value and acts on it, one of his better qualities amid his many challenging ones. Marcus smiled at the accurate assessment of the gruff chairman. He mentioned the board will likely approve my oversight of the satellite renovations as well. As they should, Dr. Taylor agreed. The proposal is exemplary. A comfortable silence fell between them, the ease of a friendship that had developed alongside their professional collaboration. After a moment, Dr. Taylor spoke again, his tone more personal than before. Elijah asked me something interesting yesterday, he said. He wanted to know if you might join us for Christmas dinner. Mrs. Garcia will be with her daughter in Florida this year, and it would just be the two of us otherwise. The invitation carried weight beyond a simple holiday meal, an incorporation into family celebration rather than merely professional association. I'd be honored, Marcus replied sincerely. Good, Dr. Taylor said with evident pleasure. Elijah will be delighted. He's already planning to show you his latest design concepts. As the evening concluded and guests began departing, Marcus found himself in conversation with the hospital's chief of surgery, a formidable woman whose exacting standards were legendary within the institution. Your vibration isolation design for the microsurgery suites is impressive, she noted without preamble. I've reviewed the specifications in detail. The tolerances exceed anything I've seen implemented in other facilities. The technology has advanced significantly in recent years, Marcus explained. We're applying approaches developed for precision manufacturing environments to medical settings. She nodded approvingly. Innovation through cross-disciplinary application, exactly the kind of thinking we need. After a brief technical discussion of the specific design elements, she added, the department heads have been uniformly impressed with your work, Mr. Johnson. You've become an essential asset to this institution very quickly. The validation from this respected professional, known for her reluctance to offer praise, represented yet another confirmation of Marcus's restored standing. The hospital took a chance on me, he acknowledged. I'm committed to ensuring that decision continues to prove beneficial. Based on results thus far, I'd say the risk has been more than justified, she replied matter-of-factly before excusing herself to speak with another. By the time Marcus stepped outside the restaurant into the snowy evening, he felt a profound sense of completion. Not of his journey, which continued to evolve, but of a critical phase in his reconstruction. The professional recognition, community contribution, and personal connections he had established over these 6 months had transformed his existence from survival to meaningful engagement. The hospital car service waited to transport him home, but Marcus opted to walk the short distance to the Taylor residence, needing the solitude to process the evening's interactions. The snow crunched beneath his shoes as he moved through Boston's historic streets, passing landmarks that had once represented the boundaries between his homeless existence and the world of privilege and purpose he had lost. Now those boundaries had dissolved, not through erasure of his experience, but through the reintegration of his capability and character into a society that had temporarily forgotten his value. The years on the streets remained part of his history, a chapter neither forgotten nor defining, but incorporated into a larger narrative that continued to unfold. As Marcus reached the entrance to the Taylor property, he paused to observe the main house where lights still burned in Elijah's room despite the late hour. The boy was likely reading advanced materials or working on his latest design concept, his brilliant mind constantly seeking new challenges. In the guest house, his home now, a light had been left on to welcome his return. The simple consideration reflected his altered status, no longer marginalized but connected, no longer forgotten but valued. What had begun with a spontaneous act of protection for a bullied child had cascaded into a comprehensive restoration of professional identity, community standing, and personal meaning. As Marcus entered his residence and removed his snow-dusted coat, he noticed an envelope that had been slipped under his door. Inside was a formal letter from the State Engineering Board, confirming his reinstatement interview scheduled for the following month, the final step toward recovering his professional licensure. The timing seemed appropriate, a confirmation of progress as he reflected on the transformative journey of these past 6 months. Marcus placed the letter on his desk beside the hospital expansion plans and the draft proposal for the Employment Pathway Program, these documents representing the interconnected aspects of his reconstructed life. From his window, Marcus could see the main hospital building in the distance, its lights glowing steadily against the night sky. In a few months, the new wing he had helped design would extend from the original structure, a physical manifestation of growth and adaptation, of new possibilities integrated with established foundations. The metaphor was not lost on him as he prepared for sleep. His own reconstruction followed similar principles, building upon the foundation of his core identity and expertise, incorporating new elements of purpose and connection, creating a structure both stronger and more adaptable than what had existed before. As Marcus Johnson, engineer, mentor, community builder, friend, settled into the quiet of his home, he recognized that the most significant outcome of these 6 extraordinary months was not the restoration of what had been lost, but the construction of something new and potentially more meaningful than what had existed before. The boy who had needed protection from bullies had become a catalyst for transformation. The father who had offered opportunity had become a friend and colleague. The professional skills that had lain dormant had been not just reactivated, but enhanced through the wisdom of experience and adversity. What awaited beyond this remarkable beginning remained to be seen, but Marcus approached that future with neither the desperate hope of his homeless years nor the comfortable certainty of his earlier career. Instead, he moved forward with conscious gratitude for the second chance he had been given, and a deep commitment to extending similar opportunities to others whose value remained hidden beneath the circumstances of their current condition. In this, Marcus had found a purpose that transcended professional achievement or personal comfort, a mission of reclamation that applied his engineer's mind to the most complex structures of all, human lives and the systems that either supported or undermined them. It was work worthy of his reconstructed life, a project limited not by the scope of his past loss, but by the breadth of his renewed vision and the depth of his hard-won resilience.